Day, May 15th, 2024. Kodiak Bear Malls, 22-year-old graduate on senior trip. May 15th, 2024. Kodiak Bear Malls, 22-year-old graduate on senior trip. The morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac at Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport as Flight 8472 descended through wisps of clouds toward Kodiak Island. Tyler Matthew Johnson pressed his face against the small window, watching the emerald wilderness unfold below like an endless green carpet punctuated by silver threads of rivers and the sapphire gleam of countless lakes. At 22 years old, Tyler had never seen anything quite like it. Born and raised in suburban Phoenix, Arizona, his idea of wilderness had been limited to weekend camping trips in the Sonoran Desert with his family, where the biggest threat was rattlesnakes and the occasional javelina. "Would you look at that?" he whispered, his breath fogging the plastic window. "It's like something out of a nature documentary." Beside him, his roommate and best friend since freshman orientation, Marcus Anthony Rivera, leaned over to peer past Tyler's shoulder. Marcus, a stocky young man with close-cropped black hair and the weathered hands of someone who'd worked construction every summer since high school, let out a low whistle. "Dude, we're really doing this. 4 years of college, and we're celebrating by throwing ourselves into the middle of nowhere, Alaska." The plane shuddered slightly as it adjusted course for final approach, and Tyler felt his stomach lurch. Not from the turbulence, but from a mixture of excitement and something else he couldn't quite name. Fear, maybe, but the good kind. The kind that made your blood sing and reminded you that you were alive. Behind them, scattered across several rows, were the other 8 members of their group. It had started as Tyler's idea during the brutal finals week of their senior year at Arizona State University. While his classmates were planning trips to Cabo or Vegas, Tyler had become obsessed with a documentary about Kodiak Island he'd watched late one night in the library. Something about the raw, untamed nature of the place had captured his imagination completely. He'd spent hours researching, reading about the massive brown bears that ruled the island, the challenging terrain, the weather that could turn deadly without warning. "It'll be an adventure," he'd told Marcus over cheap beer and cheaper pizza in their cramped apartment near campus. "Something we'll remember for the rest of our lives." Marcus had been skeptical at first. "Bro, you realize there are bears up there, right? Like really big bears that eat people?" But Tyler's enthusiasm was infectious, and gradually he'd won over not just Marcus, but an entire group of friends and acquaintances from their environmental science program. Dr. Rebecca Chen, their favorite professor, had even helped them plan the trip, providing contacts for guides and outfitters, sharing her own stories from field research in Alaska during her graduate school days 20 years earlier. "The key," Dr. Chen had told them during their final planning meeting in her cluttered office filled with rock samples and wildlife photographs, "is respect. Respect for the environment, respect for the wildlife, and respect for your own limitations. Alaska has a way of humbling even the most experienced outdoorsman." Now, as the plane touched down with a screech of tires on the runway at Kodiak Airport, Tyler felt that familiar surge of adrenaline that had driven him to propose this trip in the first place. Through the window, he could see the terminal building, modest and functional against the backdrop of rolling hills covered in spruce and hemlock. Beyond that, somewhere in that vast wilderness, was Afognak Island, their destination. The group gathered their gear in the cramped airport terminal, a chaotic collection of oversized hiking packs, camping equipment, and enough food for their planned week-long expedition. Tyler watched his friends with a mixture of pride and nervous energy. There was Jessica Ann Morrison, a petite blonde from Minnesota who'd surprised everyone by being one of the first to sign up for the trip. Despite her small stature, she couldn't have been more than 5'2", Jessica was tough as nails, with experience from countless family hunting and fishing trips in the North Woods. "My dad always said that Alaska was the ultimate test," she'd explained when they'd first discussed the trip. "He's been wanting to come up here for years, but he's been saving it for when he retires." I figured, why wait? Standing next to Jessica, helping her reorganize her pack, was David Christopher Park, whose parents had immigrated from South Korea when he was 5 years old. David was quiet and methodical, the kind of person who read instruction manuals cover to cover and always carried backup batteries for everything. He'd been Tyler's lab partner in advanced ecology, and Tyler had learned to trust David's careful, analytical approach to problem solving. "Did you remember the satellite communicator?" David asked Jessica, running through his mental checklist for the third time that morning. "It's in the side pocket of my pack," Jessica replied patiently. "Same place it's been every time you've asked." The rest of the group was equally diverse in personality and background. There was Sarah Elizabeth Collins, a red-haired nursing student from rural Oklahoma who'd grown up on a cattle ranch and could field dress a deer faster than most people could order coffee. Her boyfriend, Andrew Michael Thompson, was a pre-med student from Seattle whose idea of outdoor adventure had previously been limited to hiking the well-maintained trails around Mount Rainier with his family. "I still can't believe I let you all talk me into this," Andrew muttered as he struggled to lift his pack. At 6'4" and rail-thin, he looked like a strong wind might blow him over, despite the fact that he was in excellent shape from years of competitive swimming. "Oh, come on, Drew," Sarah laughed, using the nickname that only she was allowed to use. "Live a little. This beats studying for the MCAT for the 5th time." Rounding out the group were Emma Rose Martinez, a photography major who'd brought what seemed like a small camera store's worth of equipment, her twin brother Carlos Eduardo Martinez, who'd been Tyler's study partner in wilderness survival skills, and finally Brandon Keith Walsh, a stocky rugby player from Boston whose idea of roughing it was staying at a Holiday Inn instead of the Ritz. The twins were from El Paso, Texas, children of a Border Patrol agent and a high school teacher who'd instilled in them a deep love of the outdoors. Emma was the artist, always looking for the perfect shot, while Carlos was the practical one, more concerned with navigation and logistics. They complemented each other perfectly, finishing each other's sentences and communicating through glances and subtle gestures that only siblings could understand. Brandon, meanwhile, was there almost by accident. He'd overheard Tyler talking about the trip in the student union and had invited himself along with typical Boston directness. "You guys need someone who knows how to handle himself if things go sideways," he'd declared, flexing his considerable biceps. "Plus, my dad's a firefighter. I know all about wilderness rescue." Tyler had been skeptical about Brandon's motivations. The guy seemed more interested in proving his toughness than appreciating the natural beauty of Alaska, but the group had needed one more person to meet the minimum for their guided charter, so they'd agreed to let him join. Now, as they waited for their bush pilot to arrive, Tyler found himself studying his friends' faces, trying to memorize this moment. They all looked so young, so eager, their cheeks still pink from the artificial warmth of the airplane. In a few hours they'd be on a Fognak Island, setting up their first camp in true wilderness. The thought made his heart race with anticipation. Their pilot turned out to be a weathered woman in her 50s named Captain Sarah Sam Morrison, no relation to Jessica despite the shared surname. Captain Morrison had been flying in Alaska for over 30 years, starting as a bush pilot fresh out of the Air Force and eventually building her own charter service. She had the kind of deep tan that came from years of exposure to reflected sunlight off snow and water, and her grey hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail beneath a well-worn baseball cap advertising a local fishing lodge. "You kids picked a good week for it," she said in a gravelly voice as she inspected their gear. Weather's been stable, visibility's clear, and the bears are just coming out of hibernation, so they're more interested in finding food than bothering with humans. Tyler felt a chill run down his spine at the casual mention of bears, but he tried to play it cool. "We've done our research," he said. "We know about bear safety protocols." Captain Morrison gave him a look that was part amusement, part concern. "Research is good, son, but experience is better. You ever seen a Kodiak brown bear in person?" "Well, no," Tyler admitted. "But we've watched videos, read books." "Uh-huh." Captain Morrison's expression was unreadable. "Well, hopefully you won't need to put that book learning to the test. These bears up here, they're not like the black bears you might see in the lower 48. Adult male Kodiaks can weigh over 1,500 pounds and stand 10 feet tall on their hind legs. They're omnivores, sure, but they're also opportunistic predators. You give them a reason to see you as food, or you get between a sow and her cubs, and all the bear spray in the world might not be enough to save you." The words hung in the air as the group absorbed them. Tyler noticed that some of his friends were exchanging nervous glances, and he felt a stab of guilt. Had he downplayed the dangers when he'd convinced them to come on this trip? Dr. Chen had stressed the importance of caution, but somehow Tyler had focused more on the adventure aspect than the potential risks. "That said," Captain Morrison continued, shouldering Tyler's pack to test its weight, "if you follow proper protocols, store your food correctly, make noise when you're hiking, and keep your eyes open, you should be fine. Bears generally want to avoid humans as much as we want to avoid them. The problems usually come when people get careless or complacent." She led them across the tarmac to her aircraft, a sturdy-looking Cessna 206 that had seen better days but was obviously well-maintained. The plane was loaded with their gear and supplies for the week, including a substantial amount of bear-resistant food containers and camping equipment specifically designed for Alaska's harsh conditions. "How long have you been flying to Afognak?" David asked, as they waited for Captain Morrison to complete her pre-flight inspection. "About 15 years regularly," she replied, checking the fuel levels. "It's one of my favorite destinations, actually. Most of the island is owned by the Afognak Native Corporation, but they allow limited camping and hiking with proper permits. The ecosystem there is incredible. Old-growth Sitka spruce forests, pristine salmon streams, diverse wildlife populations. It's like stepping back in time to see what Alaska looked like before development." Emma had her camera out, documenting everything from the loading of the plane to Captain Morrison's inspection routine. "What kind of wildlife are we likely to see?" she asked, adjusting her lens settings. "Oh, you'll see plenty," Captain Morrison said with a grin. "Kodiak brown bears, obviously. Black-tailed deer, red foxes, river otters, bald eagles, various species of salmon depending on the season. The bird watching alone is worth the trip. We've got everything from Arctic terns to great horned owls." As they climbed into the cramped cabin of the Cessna, Tyler found himself crammed between Marcus and the window, his knees pressed against the seat in front of him. The interior of the plane was functional rather than comfortable, with worn fabric seats and the smell of aviation fuel mixed with decades of use. But as Captain Morrison started the engines and they began to taxi toward the runway, Tyler felt his excitement building again. "You okay, man?" Marcus asked, noticing Tyler's white-knuckled grip on his armrest. "You're not afraid of flying, are you?" "No, it's not that," Tyler replied, raising his voice over the engine noise. This is really happening, you know. 4 years ago, if someone had told me I'd be flying to a remote island in Alaska with my best friends, I'd have thought they were crazy." The plane lifted off smoothly, banking over Kodiak's harbor, where fishing boats bobbed at anchor like toys in a bathtub. As they gained altitude, the island spread out below them in all its rugged glory. Tyler could see the town of Kodiak shrinking behind them, giving way to rolling hills covered in dense forest. Rivers snaked through valleys like silver ribbons, and here and there he could spot the glint of sunlight off alpine lakes tucked between peaks. Afognak Island is about 45 minutes north of here, Captain Morrison's voice crackled through the intercom. We'll be landing on a gravel strip that was built for logging operations back in the 70s. It's not much to look at, but it gets the job done. Dilly. As they flew north over the churning waters of Shelikof Strait, Tyler found himself thinking about how this trip had evolved from a half-formed idea into reality. It had taken months of planning, saving money from part-time jobs, and convincing skeptical parents that their children could handle the risks of wilderness camping in Alaska. Tyler's own parents, Robert and Linda Johnson, had been particularly resistant to the idea. "Why can't you celebrate graduation like normal people?" his mother had asked during one of their weekly phone calls. "Go to the beach, take a cruise, visit Europe. Why does it have to be somewhere with bears and wolves and God knows what else?" His father had been more direct. "Son, I know you think you're invincible at 22, but Alaska is serious business. People die up there, experienced people who know what they're doing." But Tyler had persisted, presenting them with detailed itineraries, copies of their permits, information about their guides and emergency contacts. Eventually, worn down by his enthusiasm and impressed by the thoroughness of his planning, they'd given their blessing, along with a substantial investment in top-quality camping gear and a satellite emergency beacon. "Just promise me you'll be careful," his mother had said during their final conversation before the trip, "and call us as soon as you get back to civilization." Now, looking down at the vast wilderness passing beneath them, Tyler felt the weight of that promise. This wasn't the controlled environment of a college campus, or even the familiar desert landscapes of Arizona. This was raw, untamed nature, where human rules and expectations meant nothing, and survival depended on preparation, caution, and more than a little luck. "There it is," Captain Morrison announced, and Tyler craned his neck to see Afognak Island emerging from the morning haze. From the air, it looked like a green jewel set in dark blue water, its coastline jagged and complex, dotted with countless small bays and inlets. Dense forest covered most of the island's interior, broken only by rivers, lakes, and the occasional meadow. "It's beautiful," Jessica breathed, her face pressed against the opposite window. And it was beautiful, Tyler had to admit. But there was something about that endless expanse of forest that also seemed vaguely threatening. All those trees, all those shadows where anything could be hiding. He shook off the thought. He was being ridiculous. This was exactly what they'd come here to experience. The landing strip was exactly as Captain Morrison had described it, a rough gravel runway carved out of the forest, with a small wooden shed at one end that served as a rudimentary terminal. As they circled for landing, Tyler could see their gear bags sitting on the tarmac, supplies that had been flown in earlier that week by the outfitting company. The landing was bumpy but uneventful, the plane bouncing slightly on the uneven surface before rolling to a stop near the shed. As Captain Morrison shut down the engines, the sudden quiet was almost overwhelming. After hours of engine noise and pressurized cabin air, the silence of the wilderness felt profound and slightly unnerving. "Welcome to Afognak Island," Captain Morrison said as they climbed out of the plane. "Population, you guys, and whatever wildlife decides to pay you a visit." The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of spruce and salt water. Tyler took a deep breath, feeling his lungs expand with the pure, cold air. It was like nothing he'd ever experienced. Air so clean it almost hurt to breathe. Their guide was waiting for them by the gear pile, a tall, lean man in his 40s with sun-weathered skin and pale blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He introduced himself as Jack Daniel Kowalski, and his handshake was firm enough to make Tyler wince slightly. "Call me Jack," he said in a voice that carried just a hint of a Polish accent, a remnant, Tyler would later learn, of childhood spent with immigrant grandparents in Chicago before Jack had made his way to Alaska 20 years earlier. "I've been guiding in this area for about 8 years now, and I've been living in Alaska for 20. Before that, I was a park ranger in Yellowstone, so I know my way around bears and wilderness." Jack's credentials were impressive, Tyler had to admit. The man radiated competence and experience in a way that was immediately reassuring. He was dressed in practical outdoor gear that showed signs of heavy use, but was obviously well maintained. A large hunting knife hung from his belt, along with a can of bear spray and what looked like a GPS unit. "First things first," Jack said, looking each member of the group in the eye. "We need to go over some ground rules. This isn't a theme park, and I'm not here to entertain you. My job is to keep you alive and get you back home in one piece. That means when I tell you to do something, you do it immediately, no questions asked. Are we clear on that?" There was a chorus of nods and murmured agreements. Tyler felt a bit like he was being scolded, but he understood the necessity. This was serious business. "Good," Jack continued. "Now, let's talk about bears. Afognak Island has one of the densest populations of brown bears in Alaska. These are Kodiak brown bears, which are essentially the same species as grizzlies but tend to be larger due to the rich salmon runs and abundant food sources. An adult male can weigh anywhere from 800 to 1,500 pounds, and they're incredibly strong, fast, and intelligent." Emma raised her hand tentatively. "What's the protocol if we encounter one?" "Depends on the situation," Jack replied. "If you see a bear at a distance and it hasn't noticed you, you back away slowly and give it plenty of space. If it sees you but isn't acting aggressively, you make yourself look big, speak in a calm voice, and back away slowly while avoiding direct eye contact. You never run unless you're absolutely certain you can reach safety before the bear reaches you, and even then, running often triggers their chase instinct." "What about bear spray?" David asked, patting the canister on his belt. "Bear spray is your last line of defense," Jack said. "It's effective, but only if you use it correctly. You wait until the bear is within about 25 feet, you aim slightly downward to account for the arc of the spray, and you deploy it in a wide pattern. But here's the thing, bear spray doesn't work if you panic and miss, or if the wind is blowing the wrong way." Tyler felt his mouth go dry. When he'd researched this trip, he'd focused on the adventure aspects, the incredible scenery, the sense of accomplishment that would come from successfully completing a challenging expedition. Somehow, the reality of potentially facing a massive predator hadn't fully sunk in until now. "The most important thing," Jack continued, "is prevention. We store all food and scented items in bear-resistant containers. We camp in designated areas that are positioned to minimize bear encounters. We make noise when we're hiking, especially around blind corners or dense vegetation, and we always travel in groups. Nobody goes anywhere alone, not even to answer nature's call." As Jack spoke, Tyler found himself studying the man's face, looking for any signs of uncertainty or fear. But Jack's expression remained calm and professional throughout the safety briefing. This was clearly someone who had given this speech many times before, someone who understood the risks and knew how to manage them. "Are there any other predators we need to worry about?" Sarah asked. As a nursing student, she was always thinking about potential injuries and medical emergencies. "Wolves. But they're rarely seen and generally avoid humans," Jack replied. "The occasional lynx, but again, they're not aggressive toward people. Your biggest risks out here are bears, weather, and accidents. Speaking of which, let's talk about weather patterns." For the next hour, Jack walked them through everything from proper clothing layers to recognition of hypothermia symptoms. The man was thorough, Tyler had to give him that. He covered water purification, navigation basics, emergency signaling procedures, and even the proper way to dig a latrine. By the time he was finished, Tyler's head was spinning with information. "Any questions?" Jack asked, shouldering his own pack, which looked like it weighed at least 80 pounds. Brandon raised his hand. "Yeah, I got a question. When do we actually start hiking? Because I didn't come all the way to Alaska to sit around and listen to lectures." Jack's expression didn't change, but Tyler noticed a subtle shift in his posture, like a wolf deciding whether something was a threat or just an annoyance. "We start hiking when I'm confident that everyone in this group understands the seriousness of where we are and what we're doing. This isn't a game, son. This isn't some fraternity camping trip where the worst thing that can happen is you wake up with a hangover." Brandon's face reddened, but he didn't respond. Tyler was glad. The last thing they needed was tension between their guide and one of the group members before they'd even started hiking. "All right then," Jack said, his tone returning to its previous professionalism. "Let's get our gear sorted and head out. Our first campsite is about 6 miles from here, following an old logging road for the first 3 miles, then a game trail for the last 3. We should be able to make it there well before dark, set up camp, and get everyone settled in. The next 2 hours were spent organizing gear, checking equipment, and getting everyone's packs properly fitted." Tyler was amazed by the amount of stuff they were carrying: food for 7 days, camping equipment rated for sub-Arctic conditions, water purification tablets, first aid supplies, emergency beacons, and enough bear spray to stop a small army. His own pack, when fully loaded, weighed close to 50 pounds. Marcus, who had been hitting the gym religiously for the past 6 months in preparation for this trip, seemed to handle the weight easily. But Tyler could see that some of the others, particularly Andrew and Emma, were already struggling with the load. "It gets easier after the first day," Jack assured them as they gathered at the edge of the landing strip. "Your body adapts to the weight, and we'll be eating the food so the packs will get lighter as we go." Captain Morrison was completing her post-flight inspection, preparing to fly back to Kodiak. She approached the group one final time before leaving. "You kids be careful out there," she said, her weathered face serious. "And remember, I'll be back to pick you up exactly 1 week from today, weather permitting. If conditions are too rough for flying, you might be stuck here an extra day or 2, so plan accordingly." Tyler felt a sudden moment of panic at the thought of being stranded on the island longer than planned. What if someone got hurt? What if the weather turned bad and they couldn't get back to their normal lives? He pushed the thoughts away. This kind of negative thinking wasn't going to help anyone. "We'll be fine," he said, as much to reassure himself as Captain Morrison. "We've got the satellite communicator, emergency beacons, first aid training. We're prepared for anything." Captain Morrison nodded, but Tyler thought he detected a hint of skepticism in her eyes. "Just remember what I said about respecting the wilderness. Alaska has a way of humbling even the most prepared people." "Indeed." As the Cessna taxied down the runway and lifted off, disappearing quickly into the vast blue sky, Tyler felt the full weight of their isolation settle over the group. They were truly alone now. 10 college students and 1 guide, surrounded by hundreds of square miles of pristine wilderness. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. "All right, people," Jack called out, adjusting his pack straps. "Time to move out. We'll hike in single file, with me in the lead and Tyler bringing up the rear, since this was his idea. Everyone stay within sight of the person in front of you, and if you need to stop for any reason, call out immediately. This isn't the time to be a hero and try to tough it out." The old logging road was easier than Tyler had expected, a wide, relatively flat path through the forest that had been carved out decades earlier when timber companies had harvested parts of the island. The road surface was packed earth and gravel, overgrown in places, but still clearly defined. On either side, massive Sitka spruces towered overhead, their trunks easily 4 feet in diameter and their tops lost in the canopy high above. The forest was quieter than Tyler had anticipated. He'd expected to hear birds singing, small animals rustling in the underbrush. The kind of wildlife sounds you heard in nature documentaries. Instead, there was only the soft crunch of their footsteps on the trail, the occasional crack of a branch in the wind, and the distant sound of water running somewhere off to their left. "Is it always this quiet?" Jessica asked after they'd been hiking for about an hour. "Sometimes," Jack replied without turning around. "Wildlife tends to avoid areas with human activity, at least during the day. But don't let the quiet fool you. There are eyes watching us right now, guaranteed." Tyler felt a chill run down his spine and found himself scanning the forest on either side of the trail. The understory was dense with ferns, devil's club, and young spruce trees, creating countless shadows where anything could be hiding. Every few minutes, he thought he saw movement out of the corner of his eye, but when he turned to look directly, there was nothing there. They stopped for a rest break after 2 hours of hiking, gathering in a small clearing where the logging road widened slightly. Everyone was breathing hard, and Tyler could see sweat stains on several people's shirts, despite the cool temperature. The physical reality of carrying a heavy pack over uneven terrain was more challenging than any of them had anticipated. "How's everyone doing?" Jack asked, passing around a water bottle filled with an electrolyte solution. "Any hot spots on your feet? Any equipment issues?" Andrew was sitting on a fallen log, looking pale and slightly nauseous. "I think I might have packed too much stuff," he admitted. "My pack feels like it weighs 100 pounds. "Let's take a look," Jack said, kneeling beside Andrew's pack and starting to go through the contents. "Okay, here's your problem. You've got 3 extra pairs of shoes, a backup sleeping bag, and what appears to be an entire pharmacy worth of medications." "I wanted to be prepared," Andrew said defensively. "Preparation is good, but there's a difference between being prepared and carrying everything you own." Jack replied patiently. "We can redistribute some of this weight among the group, and some of this stuff can just stay here. You don't need 3 pairs of hiking boots for a week-long trip." As Jack helped Andrew reorganize his pack, Tyler found himself studying the rest of the group. Marcus was doing fine, as expected. The guy was built like a tank and had been preparing for this trip more seriously than anyone. Jessica and David were both handling their packs well, drawing on experience from family camping trips. Sarah looked tired but determined, while Carlos and Emma were quietly sharing the weight of Emma's camera equipment between them. Brandon was the surprise. Despite his earlier bravado, he was clearly struggling with both the weight of his pack and the humidity of the forest. His face was red and sweaty, and Tyler could see him favoring his left foot slightly. "You okay, Brandon?" Tyler asked quietly. "Fine," Brandon replied curtly. "Just not used to this kind of terrain." "Boston doesn't have a lot of dense forest hiking." Tyler nodded sympathetically, but he was starting to worry. If people were already having problems on the easy part of the hike, what would happen when they reached more challenging terrain? As if reading his thoughts, Jack stood up and addressed the group. "All right, everyone, I want to be clear about something. The next 3 miles are going to be significantly more difficult than what we've covered so far. We're leaving the logging road and following a game trail that's going to be narrow, steep in places, and sometimes barely visible. The pace is going to be slower, and we're going to need to be more careful about noise discipline." "Noise discipline?" Carlos asked. "Bears use game trails too," Jack explained. "We want to make enough noise to avoid surprising one, but not so much noise that we sound like a threat. I'll be calling out periodically, and I want everyone to respond, so I know you're all still with me." The transition from logging road to game trail was immediately noticeable. The path narrowed to barely 3 feet wide, winding between massive tree trunks and over fallen logs that had to be climbed over or crawled under. The canopy overhead was so dense that even in the middle of the day, they were hiking in a green twilight that played tricks on the eyes. Tyler found the new terrain both more challenging and more interesting. This felt like real wilderness hiking, the kind of experience he'd dreamed about when planning this trip. The trail followed the natural contours of the land, switching back and forth up a gradual slope that led toward the interior of the island. Every few hundred yards, they'd cross a small stream on makeshift log bridges or by carefully stepping from rock to rock. It was at one of these stream crossings, about an hour after leaving the logging road, that Emma spotted their first sign of bears. "Jack!" she called out, her voice tight with excitement and nervousness. "You need to see this." The guide quickly made his way back to where Emma was standing at the edge of a muddy area beside the stream. Pressed deep into the soft earth was a paw print that looked impossibly large, easily 6 inches across, with clearly visible claw marks extending another 3 inches beyond the toe pads. "Well, would you look at that?" Jack said, kneeling beside the print and holding his hand next to it for scale. His hand looked tiny in comparison. "This is from a big male, probably made this morning based on how sharp the edges are." Tyler felt his heart start to race as he stared at the massive print. All of his research, all of his preparation, hadn't really prepared him for the visceral impact of seeing physical evidence that something that large and powerful had been walking exactly where they were walking just hours earlier. "How big do you think it was?" David asked, pulling out his phone to take pictures. "Hard to say exactly from just a track, but based on the size of this print, I'd estimate somewhere between 900 and 1,200 pounds, Jack replied matter-of-factly. "A big adult male in his prime." "Jesus," Brandon muttered, the color draining from his face. "Something that big was just walking around here this morning?" "Something that big is probably still walking around here," Jack corrected. "Bears don't travel in straight lines like humans do. They follow food sources, scent trails, familiar paths. This guy could be anywhere within a 5-mile radius of this spot." Tyler noticed that several members of the group were now scanning the forest around them more intently, their earlier fatigue temporarily forgotten in the face of this tangible reminder that they were sharing this space with apex predators. "What do we do?" Sarah asked, her hand unconsciously moving to the bear spray on her belt. "We do exactly what we've been doing," Jack said calmly. "We stay together. We make appropriate noise, we keep our eyes open, and we don't do anything stupid. Remember, this bear doesn't want to meet us any more than we want to meet him. As long as we give him space and respect, we should be fine." They continued hiking, but Tyler could sense a change in the group's mood. The casual chatter that had characterized the first part of their hike had been replaced by a more focused alertness. Every rustle in the underbrush, every crack of a branch, every shadow that seemed to move independently drew immediate attention. About 30 minutes after finding the bear track, they encountered their first real challenge. A steep slope where the game trail zigzagged up about 200 feet of elevation through loose rock and exposed roots. The path was barely 2 feet wide in places, with dense vegetation on one side and a significant drop-off on the other. "We're going to take this very slowly," Jack announced, testing his footing on the loose stones. "One person moves at a time, and everyone else waits until the person ahead is completely stable before following. If you slip or feel unstable, call out immediately and sit down where you are until someone can help you." Tyler watched nervously as his friends began navigating the treacherous slope. Marcus made it look easy, his low center of gravity and strong legs allowing him to power up the incline without apparent difficulty. Jessica was more cautious, but equally successful, testing each step carefully before committing her full weight. David had more trouble, his analytical nature making him second-guess every foothold. At one point, about halfway up the slope, he froze completely, unable to decide between 2 possible routes. "I can't move," he called out, his voice tight with panic. "Every step feels like it's going to give way." Jack was beside him in seconds, moving up the slope with the kind of easy grace that came from years of experience in difficult terrain. "It's okay, David. This happens to everyone. The key is not to overthink it. Feel with your feet, trust your instincts, and remember that you're stronger and more stable than you think." With Jack's coaching and a steady hand on his elbow, David made it to the top of the slope without further incident. But Tyler could see that the experience had shaken him, and he wondered how David would handle even more challenging terrain if they encountered it. Sarah made the climb look effortless, her ranch background evident in her natural balance and confidence on unstable ground. Andrew struggled more than Tyler had expected, his long limbs and high center of gravity working against him on the steep, narrow path. At one point, a loose rock shifted under his foot, sending him sliding backwards several feet before he managed to arrest his fall by grabbing a sturdy root. "Take your time, Drew," Sarah called out encouragingly. "Don't try to rush it." The twins, Carlos and Emma, helped each other up the slope, with Carlos carrying most of Emma's camera equipment to reduce her load. Their natural teamwork and communication made the climb look almost choreographed. Brandon, despite his earlier struggles with pack weight, handled the technical terrain better than Tyler had expected. His rugby background and natural athleticism served him well on the challenging slope, though Tyler could see him favoring that left foot more noticeably. Tyler brought up the rear, as Jack had instructed, trying to keep an eye on everyone ahead of him while managing his own progress up the slope. The physical challenge was significant. His pack seemed to get heavier with each step, and the thin air at altitude made him breathe harder than usual. But there was also something deeply satisfying about the effort, a sense of accomplishment that came from overcoming natural obstacles through determination and careful technique. By the time everyone had reached the top of the slope, they were all breathing hard and sweating despite the cool temperature. But there was also a noticeable sense of achievement in the group, a shared understanding that they had successfully overcome their first real challenge as a team. "Nice work, everyone," Jack said, allowing them a few minutes to rest and rehydrate. "That's actually one of the more technical sections we'll encounter on this route. The rest of the way to our campsite should be more straightforward." As they rested, Tyler found himself looking back down the slope they'd just climbed. From above, it looked even more intimidating than it had from below. A steep, rocky face covered with loose stones and treacherous footing. The fact that they'd all made it up safely gave him a boost of confidence about their ability to handle whatever challenges lay ahead. The final hour of hiking to their campsite was, as Jack had promised, more straightforward. The game trail continued through dense forest, but the terrain was gentler, with only minor elevation changes and good footing throughout. The sounds of the forest began to return, the distant cry of eagles, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the constant whisper of wind through the spruce boughs overhead. Tyler found himself settling into a rhythm, his body adapting to the weight of the pack and the steady pace of the hike. This was exactly what he'd imagined when he'd first conceived of this trip, the sense of being truly immersed in nature, of moving through the wilderness under his own power, of being part of something larger and more fundamental than the artificial world of civilization. Their campsite, when they finally reached it, was everything Jack had promised and more. Located in a natural clearing beside a crystal-clear stream, it offered flat ground for tents, easy access to water, and excellent sight lines in all directions, important for spotting any approaching wildlife. "This is incredible," Emma breathed, immediately pulling out her camera to document the sight. The clearing was surrounded by towering spruces, with a view across the stream to a meadow where wildflowers were just beginning to bloom. In the distance, snow-capped peaks were visible through gaps in the forest canopy. "It really is beautiful," Tyler agreed, dropping his pack and feeling the immediate relief of the weight being lifted from his shoulders. "This is exactly what I was hoping we'd find." Jack was already moving around the campsite, pointing out the designated areas for tents, the bear-resistant food storage containers that had been pre-positioned by the outfitting company, and the established fire ring where they could cook their meals. "The most important thing to remember," he said as the group gathered around him, "is that we're visitors here. This clearing gets used by wildlife regularly. You can see game trails leading in from 3 different directions. We want to minimize our impact and make sure we don't leave anything behind that might attract unwanted attention." Setting up camp took the better part of 2 hours. Jack insisted on inspecting every tent to make sure it was properly secured and weatherproofed. He showed them how to use the bear-resistant containers, which required a specific sequence of movements to open, difficult for human hands, supposedly impossible for bear paws. "Food, toothpaste, soap, deodorant, anything with a scent goes in these containers," he explained, demonstrating the locking mechanism. "And I mean anything. Bears have a sense of smell that's about 7 times stronger than a bloodhound's. They can detect a candy bar from miles away." Tyler was sharing a tent with Marcus, and they'd managed to find a relatively flat spot near the edge of the clearing. As they worked together to set up their shelter, Tyler felt a deep sense of satisfaction. They'd made it through their first day, covered 6 miles of challenging terrain, and successfully established their base camp. It felt like a genuine accomplishment. "This is pretty cool," Marcus admitted, as they inflated their sleeping pads. "I mean, I was kind of skeptical about the whole thing when you first brought it up, but being out here, it's different than I expected." "Different how?" Tyler asked, curious about his friend's changing perspective. "I don't know, bigger somehow. Like, when you're back in Phoenix, you think you understand what wilderness means, but it's just an abstract concept. Out here, you really feel how small you are compared to everything else." Tyler knew exactly what Marcus meant. There was something humbling about being surrounded by forest that stretched to the horizon in every direction, knowing that the nearest road was miles away and the nearest city was even farther. It made the concerns and stresses of normal life seem almost trivial by comparison. As the sun began to set behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing, Jack gathered the group around the fire ring for their first camp dinner. The meal was simple: dehydrated camping food, rehydrated with stream water, but after a day of hiking, it tasted better than anything Tyler could remember eating. "So what's the plan for tomorrow?" Sarah asked as they sat around the small fire, watching sparks drift up toward the darkening sky. "We're going to explore some of the side trails in this area," Jack replied. "There's a waterfall about 2 miles from here that's supposed to be spectacular, and if we're lucky, we might see some of the salmon starting to run in the streams. It'll be day hiking with light packs, so it should be more enjoyable than today's slog." Tyler felt a surge of anticipation. Today had been about getting to their base camp and proving they could handle the physical challenges. Tomorrow would be about actually experiencing the natural wonders that had drawn him to Alaska in the first place. As they sat around the fire, sharing stories and getting to know each other better outside the context of college life, Tyler found himself studying his friends' faces in the flickering light. They all looked different somehow, more alert, more present than he'd ever seen them. There was something about being in the wilderness that seemed to strip away the artificial personas and social masks that everyone wore in civilization. Jessica was telling a story about a family hunting trip where she'd tracked a wounded deer for miles through similar terrain. David was asking detailed questions about the local ecosystem, his scientific curiosity fully engaged. Sarah and Andrew were sitting close together, sharing quiet conversation and looking more relaxed than Tyler had seen them in months. Brandon had been unusually quiet throughout the evening, and Tyler noticed him shifting uncomfortably every few minutes. "You doing okay?" Tyler asked quietly. "Yeah, just tired," Brandon replied, but Tyler could see him flexing his left foot repeatedly. "Not quite in the shape I thought I was." "The first day is always the hardest," Jack said, overhearing the conversation. "Tomorrow will be easier, I promise. Your body needs time to adapt to the new demands." As the fire burned down to glowing coals and the forest around them settled into its nighttime rhythm, Tyler felt a profound sense of contentment. They'd made it through their first day, overcome their first challenges, and successfully established themselves in one of the most remote and beautiful places any of them had ever seen. "Time to get some sleep," Jack announced, beginning to bank the fire. "We'll want to get an early start tomorrow. The best wildlife viewing is usually in the first few hours after sunrise." As Tyler crawled into his sleeping bag beside Marcus, he could hear the sounds of the wilderness settling in around them. The stream gurgled softly past their campsite, wind whispered through the spruce boughs overhead, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called mournfully through the darkness. "You awake?" Marcus whispered, after they'd been lying quietly for several minutes. "Yeah," Tyler replied. "Too excited to sleep, I think." "Me too. This is pretty amazing, isn't it? I mean, we're really doing this. We're actually camping in the middle of Alaska." Tyler smiled in the darkness. "I told you it would be worth it." "Yeah, you did. I just hope tomorrow goes as well as today did." Tyler was about to respond when a sound from outside their tent made him freeze. It was a low, rumbling noise, not quite a growl, but definitely not wind or water. Both men held their breath, listening intently. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by what sounded like heavy footsteps moving around the perimeter of their campsite. "Jack," Tyler whispered as loudly as he dared. "Jack, are you awake?" "I'm awake," came the guide's voice from his tent on the opposite side of the clearing. "Everyone stay in your tents and stay quiet. Don't make any sudden movements." Tyler's heart was pounding so hard he was sure it could be heard throughout the campsite. Through the thin nylon wall of their tent, he could hear something large moving through the underbrush just a few yards away. Whatever it was definitely bigger than a person, and it seemed to be investigating their camp with methodical thoroughness. The sounds continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Heavy breathing, the crack of branches, the soft thud of large paws on forest floor. At one point, Tyler was sure he could hear sniffing just outside their tent, as if something was testing the air for interesting scents. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the investigation stopped. The sounds of movement faded into the distance, leaving only the normal nighttime sounds of the forest. "Everyone okay?" Jack called out softly after several minutes of silence. There was a chorus of nervous affirmatives from around the campsite. "What was that?" Emma's voice was tight with fear. "Bear, most likely," Jack replied calmly. "Probably just checking us out, making sure we're not a threat or a food source. As long as everyone followed the food storage protocols, we should be fine." Tyler lay awake for a long time after that, listening to every sound from outside their tent and trying to process what had just happened. They'd been visited by a bear, possibly the same one whose track they'd seen earlier, and it had wandered through their campsite while they lay helpless in their sleeping bags. The reality of their situation hit him with sudden clarity. They weren't just camping in bear country, they were guests in the bear's territory, completely dependent on the animal's tolerance and their own careful behavior to stay safe. It was both terrifying and exhilarating, and Tyler found himself more awake than ever as he contemplated what the next 6 days might bring. When he finally did fall asleep, his dreams were filled with massive shadows moving through dark forests, golden eyes reflecting firelight, and the sound of something large and powerful breathing just outside the fragile barrier of his tent wall. Tyler woke to the sound of Jack moving around the campsite, quietly starting a fire and preparing breakfast. Through the tent wall, he could see that the sky was just beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. He checked his watch. 5:30 a.m. His body ached from sleeping on the ground, and his shoulders were stiff from carrying the pack the day before, but he felt surprisingly alert and eager to start the day. "You awake?" he whispered to Marcus, who was still buried deep in his sleeping bag. "Unfortunately," Marcus replied, his voice muffled by the fabric. "I feel like I got hit by a truck. How are you not completely destroyed?" "I am destroyed," Tyler admitted, "but I'm also more excited than I've been in years." "Did you hear all that noise last night?" "Are you kidding?" "I was awake for hours listening to Yogi Bear doing reconnaissance on our camp. I kept expecting him to stick his head through the tent wall and ask if we had any pick-a-nick baskets." Despite his nervousness about the previous night's encounter, Tyler found himself laughing at Marcus's reference. Jack seemed pretty calm about the whole thing. Jack seems pretty calm about everything. I think the guy could be getting mauled by a grizzly, and he'd just calmly explain proper bear attack protocol while it was happening. They could hear other members of the group starting to stir in their tents, along with the quiet conversation of people who had also been kept awake by their unexpected visitor. Through the tent wall, Tyler could smell coffee brewing and what might have been bacon cooking on the camp stove. "All right, people," Jack called out. "Rise and shine. We've got a beautiful day ahead of us, and I want to get on the trail early while the wildlife is still active." Tyler and Marcus quickly dressed and packed up their sleeping gear, then emerged from their tent to find the rest of the group in various stages of waking up. Some, like Jessica and David, looked bright-eyed and ready for adventure. Others, particularly Andrew and Brandon, looked like they'd rather be anywhere else in the world. "How did everyone sleep?" Jack asked cheerfully as he handed out cups of coffee that tasted like it could wake the dead. "Apart from our furry friend's midnight social call, not too bad," Carlos replied, accepting a plate of scrambled eggs and bacon. "Any idea what kind of bear it was?" "Hard to say for certain, without seeing it, but based on the sounds and the tracks we found yesterday, I'd guess it was a large male brown bear. Probably just curious about the new neighbors." Emma had her camera out, documenting the morning routine. "Do you think it will come back?" "Possible," Jack said with a shrug. "Bears are creatures of habit, and they tend to follow established routes through their territory. But as long as we maintain proper food storage and don't give him a reason to associate us with food, he should lose interest and move on." Tyler noticed that Brandon was sitting slightly apart from the group, nursing his coffee and looking distinctly uncomfortable. "How's the foot?" Tyler asked quietly. "Better this morning," Brandon replied, but Tyler could see him flexing it gingerly. "I think I just need to break in my boots a little more." After breakfast and breaking camp, they set off on their first day hike with significantly lighter packs containing only water, lunch, first aid supplies, and emergency gear. The difference in weight was immediately noticeable, and Tyler felt like he could practically dance down the trail compared to the previous day's slog. The morning air was crisp and clear, with shafts of golden sunlight filtering through the forest canopy and highlighting the mist rising from the stream. Jack led them along a different trail than they'd used to reach the campsite, this one following the watercourse upstream toward the interior of the island. This drainage system eventually connects to one of the major salmon spawning areas, Jack explained as they hiked. "We're a little early in the season for the big runs, but we might see some early arrivals testing the waters." The trail was well-defined and relatively easy compared to the previous day's challenges, winding through old-growth forest alongside the stream. The sound of running water provided a constant soundtrack, punctuated by bird calls from the canopy overhead and the occasional splash of what might have been fish jumping in the deeper pools. About an hour into their hike, Jack suddenly stopped and held up his hand for silence. The group immediately froze, everyone straining to hear whatever had caught his attention. "There," Jack whispered, pointing across the stream to a small meadow about 50 yards away. "Do you see it?" Tyler squinted in the direction Jack was indicating, and after a moment he spotted movement in the tall grass. A young black-tailed deer was grazing peacefully, apparently unaware of their presence. It was smaller than the white-tailed deer Tyler was familiar with from nature documentaries, but it moved with the same graceful alertness that characterized all wild animals. Emma was frantically adjusting her camera settings, trying to capture the moment without making noise that might spook the animal. The deer continued grazing for several minutes, occasionally lifting its head to scan for threats before returning to the serious business of breakfast. "That's a yearling," Jack whispered, "probably separated from its mother recently and establishing its own territory. We're lucky to see it. They're usually much more skittish around humans." As if summoned by Jack's words, the deer suddenly lifted its head and stared directly at their group. For a moment, predator and prey regarded each other across the stream, two different worlds acknowledging each other's existence. Then, with a flash of white tail, the deer bounded away into the forest, disappearing so quickly that Tyler almost wondered if he'd imagined the whole encounter. "Wow," Sarah breathed. "That was incredible. I've never seen a wild deer that close before." "That's nothing," Jack said with a grin. "Wait until we see what's waiting for us at the waterfall." They continued upstream, the trail gradually gaining elevation as they moved deeper into the island's interior. The forest around them began to change subtly. The trees were larger and more widely spaced, creating a cathedral-like atmosphere beneath the canopy. Moss and ferns covered every surface, giving the understory an almost primeval appearance. Tyler found himself constantly stopping to stare at details he'd never noticed in forests back home. The way morning light filtered through the canopy created an ever-changing pattern of shadows and golden highlights. The air itself seemed different, cleaner somehow, with a richness that made every breath feel like a luxury. "This place is like something out of a fairy tale," Jessica said, echoing Tyler's thoughts. "I keep expecting to see trolls or elves hiding behind the trees." The Tlingit people who originally inhabited this area believed that every tree, every stream, every rock had its own spirit, Jack said as they paused for a water break. "Spending time out here, you start to understand what they meant. There's definitely something special about old-growth forest that you can't find anywhere else." David was examining a massive spruce tree whose trunk was easily 6 feet in diameter. "How old do you think this is?" he asked, running his hands over the deeply furrowed bark. "Hard to say without taking a core sample, but trees this size in this environment are probably at least 300 to 400 years old," Jack replied. "Some of the really big ones might be pushing 600 years. This tree was already ancient when the first European explorers reached Alaska." Tyler tried to wrap his mind around that kind of timescale. This tree had been growing here since before the United States existed as a country, through countless generations of wildlife, through natural disasters and climate changes that would have reshaped the entire ecosystem around it. It was a humbling reminder of how brief human lives were in comparison to the natural world. The sound of falling water gradually became audible over the stream's gentle murmur, growing louder as they continued upstream. The trail began to climb more steeply, following switchbacks up a rocky slope toward what Jack promised would be a spectacular payoff. "Almost there," Jack called back to the group as they navigated a particularly steep section. "Just another few hundred yards." Tyler could feel his anticipation building with each step. He'd seen pictures of waterfalls in Alaska, of course, but he knew that no photograph could capture the full sensory experience of standing in front of thousands of gallons of water plunging over a cliff face. When they finally emerged from the forest into the amphitheater surrounding the waterfall, Tyler's breath caught in his throat. The cascade was everything he'd hoped for and more, a ribbon of white water plunging nearly 200 feet from a rocky ledge high above, creating a mist that caught the morning sunlight and threw rainbows across the entire basin. "Oh my God," Emma whispered, immediately pulling out her camera and starting to shoot. "This is incredible, absolutely incredible." The waterfall fed into a deep pool at the base of the cliff, which in turn flowed out to become the stream they'd been following. The entire area was enclosed by towering rock walls, covered in moss and small trees that seemed to be growing directly out of the stone. The sound was overwhelming, a constant roar that made conversation difficult and seemed to resonate in Tyler's chest. "Is it safe to get closer?" Sarah asked, raising her voice to be heard over the noise. "There's a trail down to the pool," Jack replied, pointing to a narrow path that wound down the rocky slope. "Just be careful on the wet rocks. Everything gets slippery near the base." They spent the next hour exploring the waterfall area, taking pictures, eating lunch on the rocks beside the pool, and simply absorbing the magnificent spectacle. Tyler found himself sitting on a boulder at the water's edge, feeling the mist on his face and trying to memorize every detail of the experience. This was exactly what he'd dreamed of when he'd first conceived this trip. Moments of natural beauty so powerful that they made everything else seem insignificant by comparison. The stress of final exams, worries about post-graduation job searches, even the ever-present concerns about student loans and adult responsibilities, all of it faded away in the face of this raw, timeless beauty. "Hey, Tyler," Marcus called out, interrupting his reverie. "Come check this out." Tyler made his way carefully across the wet rocks to where Marcus was standing at the edge of the pool, pointing down into the crystal-clear water. "Are those fish?" Marcus asked. Tyler peered into the depths and saw them, dark shadows moving slowly through the deeper water near the base of the falls. They were larger than he'd expected, easily 2 feet long, with the distinctive hooked jaws that he recognized from nature documentaries about salmon. "Those are Chinook salmon," Jack said, joining them at the water's edge, "also called king salmon. They're some of the early arrivals, testing the waters before the main spawning run begins in a few weeks." "They're huge," David said, pulling out his phone to try to capture video of the fish. "I had no idea salmon got that big." "Chinooks are the largest of the Pacific salmon species," Jack explained. "Adults can weigh anywhere from 30 to 50 pounds, sometimes even more. These guys have spent the last few years in the ocean, building up their strength for this final journey upstream to spawn." Tyler watched the salmon moving through the pool with a mixture of admiration and sadness. He knew from his environmental science classes that these fish were nearing the end of their life cycle, that they would spawn in the gravel beds upstream and then die, their bodies providing nutrients for the entire ecosystem. It was beautiful and tragic at the same time. "The bears know they're here," Jack continued. "That's probably why we had our visitor last night. Once the main run starts, this whole area will be full of brown bears looking for easy meals." The thought of bears fishing for salmon just a few yards from where they were standing gave Tyler a little chill. It was another reminder that they were temporary visitors in a world where the real residents were much larger and more powerful than they were. After lunch, they began the hike back toward their campsite, following the same trail they'd used that morning. The return journey felt easier somehow, partly because they were familiar with the route and partly because Tyler's body was beginning to adapt to the demands of wilderness hiking. About halfway back to camp, Jack stopped the group and pointed to a large tree that had been stripped of bark in a distinctive pattern about 8 feet off the ground. "Bear sign," he said simply. "Males will mark territory by scratching and biting trees, usually as high as they can reach." Based on the height of these marks, I'd say this was made by the same individual whose track we found yesterday. Tyler stared at the claw marks gouged deep into the wood, trying to imagine the size and strength of the animal that had made them. The thought that something that powerful had been walking these same trails, possibly watching them even now from the forest, was both thrilling and terrifying. "How recently?" Brandon asked, his voice tight with concern. "Hard to say exactly, but the wood inside the scratches is still relatively fresh-looking, probably within the last week or two." They continued back toward camp, but Tyler noticed that everyone was more alert now, scanning the forest around them more carefully and staying closer together. The bear sign had been a vivid reminder that they were sharing this territory with creatures that could kill them without much effort. Their campsite looked exactly as they'd left it that morning, with no signs of unwanted visitors. Jack inspected the bear containers and found them undisturbed, which he declared a good sign. "If our friend from last night was seriously interested in our food, he would have tried to get into these containers," Jack explained. "The fact that he didn't suggest he was just curious, not hungry." Tyler hoped Jack was right, but he found himself studying the forest around their campsite with new eyes, wondering how many hidden watching posts might offer a good view of their activities. The afternoon was spent exploring the immediate area around their camp, with Jack pointing out various aspects of the local ecosystem. They found more deer tracks, several different types of bird nests, and what appeared to be the den of a fox family beneath the roots of a large spruce tree. "The biodiversity here is incredible," David said, taking notes in a small field journal. "I'm seeing species I've only read about in textbooks. That's one of the benefits of visiting areas that are still relatively untouched by human development," Jack replied. "The ecosystem can function the way it evolved to function, without the disruptions and fragmentations that come with roads, buildings, and other infrastructure." As evening approached, they gathered around the fire ring for their second camp dinner. The meal was more elaborate than the previous night. Jack had brought fresh ingredients that needed to be used before they spoiled, including steaks that he grilled over the open fire. "This is the best meal I've had in months," Andrew declared, cutting into his perfectly cooked steak. "I'm starting to understand why people become obsessed with wilderness camping." "It does get into your blood," Jack agreed. "There's something about being completely self-sufficient, living with just what you can carry, depending on your own skills and knowledge to stay safe and comfortable. It strips away a lot of the artificial complications of modern life." Tyler found himself nodding in agreement. After just 2 days in the wilderness, he already felt different, more alert, more aware of his surroundings, more connected to the natural rhythms of day and night. The constant stimulation and distraction of digital life seemed like a distant memory. As they sat around the fire, sharing stories and getting to know each other better, Tyler felt a deep sense of satisfaction with how the trip was progressing. Everyone seemed to be adapting well to the physical demands. The group dynamics were positive, and they'd already experienced some incredible natural moments that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. "So, what's the plan for tomorrow?" Jessica asked as Jack began banking the fire for the night. "We're going to break camp and move to our second site," Jack replied. "It's about 8 miles from here, following a different drainage system toward the eastern side of the island. The terrain is a bit more challenging, but the destination is worth it. We'll be camping right on the coast with views of the mainland mountains." Tyler felt a surge of excitement at the prospect of seeing the ocean after 3 days in the forest. The variety of landscapes they were experiencing was exactly what he'd hoped for when planning this trip. "How challenging is the terrain?" Andrew asked, a note of concern in his voice. "Nothing we can't handle," Jack assured him. "One significant creek crossing and a few steep sections, but overall it's comparable to what we did today. The main difference is that we'll be carrying full packs again." As the group dispersed to their tents for the night, Tyler found himself looking forward to the challenges of the next day. His body was adapting to the physical demands. His confidence was growing with each successful challenge they overcame, and his appreciation for the wilderness was deepening with every hour they spent in this incredible environment. "How are you feeling about everything so far?" Marcus asked, as they settled into their sleeping bags. "Better than I hoped," Tyler replied honestly. "I mean, it's been challenging, but that's exactly what I wanted. I feel like we're actually doing something meaningful here, you know, not just consuming entertainment or checking items off a bucket list, but actually engaging with the natural world on its own terms." "I have to admit, you were right about this being an adventure we'd remember for the rest of our lives," Marcus said. "Though I could do without the midnight bear visits." They lay quietly for a while, listening to the familiar sounds of the stream and the wind in the trees. Tyler was just drifting off to sleep when he heard it again, the sound of something large moving through the forest near their campsite. This time he wasn't as frightened. The previous night's experience had taught him that bears were curious, but not necessarily aggressive, and Jack's calm handling of the situation had given him confidence in their safety protocols. Still, he listened carefully as the sounds moved around the perimeter of their camp, following what seemed to be a familiar route. After about 10 minutes, the sounds faded into the distance, and Tyler allowed himself to relax completely. They were guests in bear country, and it seemed their host was simply making his regular rounds to check on the new neighbors. Tyler's third day in the Alaskan wilderness dawned clear and cold, with a thin layer of frost covering their tents and the surrounding vegetation. The temperature had dropped significantly during the night, and Tyler's breath formed clouds in the crisp morning air as he emerged from his sleeping bag. "Jesus, it's cold," Marcus muttered, pulling on an extra layer of clothing. "I thought it was supposed to be spring up here." "Spring in Alaska is a relative concept," Jack said cheerfully as he started the morning fire. "The good news is that it'll warm up quickly once the sun gets above the trees. The bad news is that we've got 8 miles to cover today, and some of it's going to be through pretty challenging terrain." Tyler noticed that Brandon was moving even more stiffly than usual as he emerged from his tent. The rugby player's earlier confidence seemed to be eroding with each passing day, replaced by a grim determination that Tyler found somewhat concerning. "How's everyone feeling this morning?" Jack asked as he distributed coffee and breakfast. "Any injuries, hot spots, equipment issues?" "I've got a blister forming on my left heel," Emma admitted, pulling off her boot to show a red, inflamed area. "I probably should have mentioned it yesterday." Jack examined the blister with the practiced eye of someone who dealt with countless hiking injuries. "That's going to be a problem if we don't take care of it now," he said, pulling out a comprehensive first aid kit. "We'll clean it, apply some padding, and adjust your lacing to reduce pressure, but you need to tell me immediately if it gets worse." Tyler watched Jack work with professional efficiency, cleaning and bandaging Emma's foot while explaining the proper treatment to the rest of the group. It was clear that the guide had extensive medical training beyond basic wilderness first aid. "Everyone else okay?" Jack asked as he finished treating Emma's blister. Andrew raised his hand tentatively. "I'm getting some chafing from my pack straps." "Nothing serious, but it's starting to get uncomfortable." "Let's take a look," Jack said, examining the red marks on Andrew's shoulders where the pack straps had been rubbing. "We can add some padding here and adjust the fit. The key is to address these things before they become serious problems." Tyler was impressed by Jack's attention to detail and his obvious concern for the group's well-being. It was clear that preventing problems was much easier than dealing with injuries in the wilderness, where evacuation could take hours or even days. After breakfast and the necessary equipment adjustments, they broke camp and began their longest hiking day yet. The trail led away from the stream they'd been following, climbing gradually through dense forest toward a ridge that would eventually take them to their second campsite. The terrain was immediately more challenging than anything they'd encountered so far. The trail was fainter, sometimes disappearing entirely for several yards before reappearing around a fallen log or rock outcropping. The undergrowth was denser too, with devil's club and slide alder creating natural barriers that had to be carefully navigated. "This is more like actual wilderness hiking," Jack explained, as they paused to consult his GPS unit and topographic map. "The trails we've been on so far were originally created for logging access. This route follows traditional hunting and fishing paths that have been used for centuries." Tyler found the increased difficulty both challenging and exhilarating. This felt like real exploration, the kind of hiking that required constant attention and decision-making rather than simply following an obvious path. Every few yards presented new obstacles: fallen trees to climb over, muddy sections to navigate around, steep sections where they had to use their hands as much as their feet. About 2 hours into the hike, they encountered their first major obstacle, a creek crossing that was significantly more challenging than the small streams they'd hopped across on previous days. The water was running fast and deep, fed by snowmelt from the higher elevations, and there was no obvious bridge or easy ford. "All right, people," Jack said, studying the creek carefully. "This is going to require some technique. The water's moving fast enough to knock you down if you're not careful, and it's cold enough to cause hypothermia if you fall in." Tyler stared at the rushing water with growing apprehension. It looked treacherous, fast-moving, obviously deep in the middle, with a rocky bottom that would be slippery and unstable. The thought of crossing it with a heavy pack while trying to maintain his balance seemed almost impossible. "What's the technique?" David asked, his scientific curiosity overriding his obvious nervousness. "We'll cross one at a time, using trekking poles for stability," Jack explained. "The key is to face upstream, move slowly, and test each step before committing your full weight. If you feel yourself losing balance, don't fight it. Go with the flow and try to protect your head and pack." Jack demonstrated the technique, moving deliberately across the creek with smooth, controlled movements. He made it look easy, but Tyler could see the concentration on his face and the careful attention he paid to each foot placement. "Who's next?" Jack called from the opposite bank. Marcus volunteered, and Tyler watched nervously as his friend entered the fast-moving water. Marcus was strong and athletic, but Tyler could see him struggling to maintain his balance against the current. About halfway across, he slipped on a loose rock and went down to one knee, but he managed to recover and complete the crossing without falling completely. "That was sketchy as hell," Marcus called back to the group. "The rocks are incredibly slippery, and the current is stronger than it looks." One by one, the group members crossed the creek with varying degrees of success. Jessica made it across with the same calm competence she'd shown throughout the trip. David took his time, carefully testing each step, and managed the crossing without incident. Sarah crossed with typical ranch girl confidence, moving quickly but deliberately across the treacherous footing. Andrew was more tentative, taking nearly 10 minutes to complete the crossing, but he eventually made it to the other side without falling. Carlos crossed first among the twins, then helped guide Emma's footsteps by voice as she followed his exact route. Their teamwork was impressive, and both completed the crossing safely. Brandon was the last to cross, and Tyler could see that he was struggling even before he entered the water. His injured foot was obviously bothering him more than he'd admitted, and the combination of pain and uncertainty made his movements awkward and hesitant. Halfway across, Brandon's injured foot slipped on a moss-covered rock, and he went down hard into the fast-moving water. Tyler's heart stopped as he watched his friend disappear beneath the surface, his heavy pack threatening to drag him downstream. Jack was in the water instantly, reaching Brandon just as he managed to get his head above the surface. Between the two of them, they managed to get Brandon to the far bank, where he collapsed on the rocks, soaking wet and shivering violently. "Hypothermia risk," Jack said tersely, immediately starting to strip off Brandon's wet clothing. "We need to get him warm and dry immediately." The next hour was spent getting Brandon into dry clothes, setting up an emergency shelter, and gradually warming him up with hot drinks and body heat. It was Tyler's first real glimpse of how quickly things could go wrong in the wilderness, and how serious the consequences could be. "I'm fine," Brandon kept insisting through chattering teeth, but Tyler could see that he was anything but fine. The fall had shaken his confidence as much as it had chilled his body, and the injury to his foot was clearly more serious than he'd been willing to admit. "We need to talk about options," Jack said quietly to Tyler, while the others tended to Brandon. "He's not going to be able to maintain the pace for the rest of the trip, and that foot needs proper medical attention." Tyler felt a sinking sensation in his stomach. "What are our options?" "We can arrange an emergency evacuation, or we can modify our plans and set up a base camp where he can rest while the rest of us continue with day hikes," Jack replied. "But honestly, given the terrain we're supposed to cover over the next few days, I'd recommend evacuation." The thought of cutting the trip short, of failure before they'd even reached the halfway point, was devastating to Tyler. This was supposed to be their great adventure, their celebration of completing college, their proof that they could handle real challenges. But looking at Brandon shivering in the emergency shelter, Tyler knew that his friend's safety had to take priority over adventure goals. "Let's see how he feels in an hour or two," Tyler said finally. "Maybe the rest and warm-up will be enough to get him back on his feet." Jack nodded, but Tyler could see the skepticism in his eyes. In the guide's professional judgment, Brandon was done for this trip, and trying to push forward would only make things worse. While they waited for Brandon to recover, Jack used the time to conduct an impromptu lesson on wilderness first aid and emergency procedures. He showed them how to recognize and treat hypothermia, how to improvise emergency shelters, and how to use their satellite communicator to call for help if necessary. "The key thing to remember," Jack said, as he demonstrated proper use of the emergency beacon, "is that there's no shame in calling for help when you need it. The wilderness doesn't care about your ego or your plans. It only cares about whether you make smart decisions or stupid ones." Tyler found himself thinking about that advice as they waited. Was pushing forward with an injured team member a smart decision or a stupid one? How much risk was acceptable in pursuit of adventure? Where was the line between reasonable challenge and reckless endangerment? After 2 hours of rest and rewarming, Brandon declared himself ready to continue. He was walking better, his color had returned, and his shivering had stopped. But Tyler could see that the experience had shaken him badly, and he wondered if Brandon was being honest about his physical condition or just trying to avoid being the reason the trip was cut short. "Are you sure?" Jack asked, studying Brandon's face carefully. "There's no shame in calling it here. We can have you back in Kodiak by this evening, getting proper medical attention for that foot." "I'm sure," Brandon said firmly. "It was just a slip." "I'm fine now." Jack looked doubtful but didn't press the issue. They packed up the emergency shelter and resumed their hike, but Tyler noticed that Jack stayed much closer to Brandon for the rest of the day, ready to intervene if there were any signs of further problems. The remainder of the hike to their second campsite was completed without major incident, though it took significantly longer than Jack had originally planned. The terrain continued to be challenging, with several more creek crossings, a steep climb over a rocky saddle, and a descent through dense forest that required careful navigation to stay on the proper trail. By the time they reached their destination in the late afternoon, everyone was exhausted. The campsite was spectacular, a grassy meadow overlooking the ocean, with views of snow-capped mountains on the mainland across the water. But Tyler was too tired and stressed to fully appreciate it. Setting up camp was more difficult than it had been at their first sight. The coastal location meant dealing with wind that threatened to blow their tents away, and the ground was harder and rockier, making it difficult to drive tent stakes. But eventually, they managed to establish a secure camp and gather around the fire ring for dinner. "How's everyone holding up?" Jack asked, as they shared their second night of camp food. "Tired but good," Jessica replied, speaking for most of the group. "Today was definitely more challenging than yesterday." "It's supposed to get easier from here," Jack said, consulting his itinerary. "Tomorrow's a rest day with optional day hikes, and then we'll have 2 more travel days before Captain Morrison picks us up." Tyler noticed that Brandon was sitting slightly apart from the group again, favoring his injured foot and looking generally miserable. The day's challenges had clearly taken a toll on him, both physically and psychologically. "Hey, Brandon," Tyler said quietly, moving to sit beside his friend. "How are you really doing?" "Honestly, I'm starting to think I'm in over my head," Brandon admitted. "This is a lot harder than I expected, and I don't want to be the weak link that ruins everyone else's trip." "You're not ruining anything," Tyler assured him, though privately he was concerned about Brandon's ability to complete the remaining days. "We're all finding this more challenging than we expected." "Maybe, but you guys are handling it better than I am." "That creek crossing today. I've never been that scared in my life. For a minute there, I thought I was going to drown in some random stream in the middle of nowhere, Alaska." Tyler didn't know what to say to that. He'd been scared too during the creek crossing, but he'd also felt exhilarated by the challenge. It was becoming clear that he and Brandon had very different relationships with risk and adventure. As the sun set over the ocean, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that Tyler had never seen before, he found himself torn between concern for his friend and excitement about the experiences still to come. They were halfway through their trip, and despite the challenges and Brandon's struggles, they'd accomplished something genuinely impressive. "You know what?" Tyler said to Brandon as they watched the sunset together. "Whatever happens over the next few days, we've already done something pretty amazing. How many people our age have hiked into the Alaskan wilderness and camped beside the ocean?" Brandon nodded slowly. "You're right. I may be struggling, but this is still the most incredible place I've ever been." As the group settled in for their third night in the wilderness, Tyler felt cautiously optimistic about their prospects for completing the trip successfully. Brandon seemed to be in better spirits. Everyone else was adapting well to the physical demands, and they'd successfully overcome their most challenging day yet. But as he lay in his sleeping bag listening to the unfamiliar sounds of wind and waves, Tyler couldn't shake the feeling that their real tests were still ahead of them. The wilderness had shown them a glimpse of its power during the creek crossing, and he suspected it wasn't finished with them yet. The sound that woke Tyler on their 4th morning was different from anything he'd heard during their previous nights in the wilderness. It wasn't the gentle rustle of wind through trees or the familiar gurgle of running water. It was a low, powerful sound that seemed to come from the forest itself, a deep, rumbling vocalization that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Beside him, Marcus was instantly awake, his body tense with alertness. "What was that?" he whispered. Before Tyler could respond, the sound came again, closer this time, and unmistakably the vocalization of a large animal. It was followed by the crack of breaking branches and the heavy thud of footsteps that seemed to shake the ground beneath their tent. "Jack!" Tyler called out softly, trying to keep his voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "I hear it," came Jack's immediate response from his tent across the clearing. "Everyone stay in your tents and stay quiet. Don't make any sudden movements." The sounds continued for several minutes. Heavy breathing, more vocalizations, and the unmistakable noise of something large moving around the perimeter of their campsite. Tyler found himself holding his breath, straining to interpret every sound, trying to determine how close the animal was and whether it was showing any signs of aggression. Then, suddenly, there was a different kind of sound, the metallic clang of something being knocked over, followed by what sounded like frustrated huffing and more heavy footsteps. "Oh, shit." Jack's voice was tight with concern. "I think it's gotten into our food storage." Tyler's heart sank. They'd been meticulous about following bear safety protocols, storing all their food and scented items in the bear-resistant containers, exactly as Jack had instructed. If a bear had managed to breach those defenses, they were in serious trouble. The sounds of investigation continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Tyler could hear metal scraping against rock, more frustrated vocalizations, and the continued movement of something large and powerful just outside their fragile tent walls. Finally, after an eternity of tension, the sounds began to fade as whatever was investigating their camp moved away into the forest. Jack waited several more minutes before emerging from his tent to assess the situation. "Everyone stay put for now," Jack called out. "I'm going to check the damage." Tyler could hear Jack moving around the campsite, and after a few minutes, the guide's voice carried a note of relief. "Good news and bad news. The bear containers held. He couldn't get them open, but he did make a hell of a mess trying." One by one, the group emerged from their tents to survey the aftermath of their nocturnal visitor. The scene was both impressive and terrifying. The heavy bear containers had been moved several yards from their original positions, showing clear evidence of being rolled, lifted, and thrown by something incredibly strong. Deep claw marks scarred the metal surfaces, and one container had been knocked completely off its platform. "Jesus," Brandon said, his voice shaky. "Look at the size of those claw marks." Tyler examined the gouges in the metal, trying to imagine the size and power of the claws that had made them. They were easily 3 inches long and had cut through the metal surface like it was soft wood. "This was definitely our friend from the previous nights," Jack said, studying the tracks in the soft earth around the containers. "But he was a lot more persistent this time. Usually, if they can't get into the containers quickly, they lose interest and move on." "Why was he more aggressive?" Jessica asked, her face pale with the realization of how close they'd come to a potentially dangerous encounter. "Could be several reasons," Jack replied, continuing his examination of the scene. "Maybe he's getting hungrier as natural food sources become harder to find. Maybe he's starting to associate our camp with food, even though he can't access it. Or maybe he's just naturally more persistent than average." Tyler felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. The idea that they might be dealing with a bear that was becoming fixated on their camp was deeply unsettling. "What does this mean for the rest of our trip?" Sarah asked, voicing the question that Tyler was afraid to ask. Jack was quiet for a long moment, studying the evidence of the bear's investigation. "It means we need to be extra careful from here on out. This level of persistence suggests he's not going to just lose interest and move on. He's figured out that we have food, and he's going to keep trying to get to it." "Are we in danger?" Andrew asked directly. "Not immediately," Jack replied. "As long as we maintain proper protocols and don't do anything to escalate the situation, we should be fine. But we need to be more vigilant, and we need to be prepared to modify our plans if his behavior escalates further." Tyler noticed that Jack's tone had changed from the confident reassurance of previous days to something more cautious and concerned. It was clear that this level of bear interest was beyond what the guide considered normal or easily manageable. After breakfast and a thorough check of their equipment, Jack announced a change in plans. Instead of the optional day hikes he'd originally scheduled, they would break camp immediately and move to their next site, hoping to distance themselves from the bear that seemed to be claiming their current location as part of his territory. "I thought today was supposed to be a rest day," Emma said, as she began packing her tent with obvious reluctance. "Plans change in the wilderness," Jack replied. Staying here when we know there's a persistent bear in the area would be asking for trouble. Better to move and put some distance between us and him. The hurried breaking of camp and preparation for another full day of hiking cast a shadow over the group's mood. Tyler could see the strain on everyone's faces. The combination of interrupted sleep, constant alertness, and the underlying stress of knowing they were being stalked by a massive predator was taking its toll. Brandon, in particular, looked haggard and overwhelmed. His injured foot was clearly bothering him more after the previous day's challenges, and the prospect of another long hike seemed almost unbearable. "Maybe this is a good time to call for that evacuation," Tyler suggested quietly to Jack as they finished loading their packs. "Not yet," Jack replied. "Let's see how the next 24 hours go. If the bear follows us to the new site, or if Brandon's condition deteriorates further, then we'll reconsider. But right now, I think we can still complete the trip safely." Tyler wasn't entirely convinced, but he trusted Jack's judgment. The guide had years of experience in situations like this, and he'd kept them safe so far despite the increasing challenges. The hike to their third campsite was supposed to be relatively easy, mostly downhill through forest, following well-established game trails toward a lake in the island's interior. But the combination of fatigue, stress, and Brandon's worsening condition made it feel like their most difficult day yet. About 2 hours into the hike, Brandon stumbled over a root and went down hard, landing awkwardly on his injured foot. The sound he made, half cry of pain, half frustrated scream, echoed through the forest and caused everyone to freeze with alarm. "I can't do this anymore," Brandon said, sitting on the ground and holding his foot. "I'm done. I'm completely done." Jack was beside him immediately, examining the foot through Brandon's boot. "We need to get this boot off and take a look," he said. "This might be more serious than we thought." When they finally got Brandon's boot and sock off, the extent of the injury became clear. His foot was swollen and discolored, with obvious signs of inflammation around the ankle and instep. What had started as a minor hiking injury had become something that clearly required medical attention. "That's not a simple blister or hot spot," Jack said grimly. "That's a significant soft tissue injury, possibly a stress fracture. You need X-rays and proper medical treatment." The implications hit Tyler like a physical blow. They were in the middle of nowhere, at least a day's hike from the nearest place a rescue helicopter could land, with an injured team member who couldn't continue on his own power. "What are our options?" Tyler asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Emergency evacuation," Jack replied without hesitation. "I'll activate the satellite beacon and request immediate medical evacuation. Depending on weather conditions and helicopter availability, we might have Brandon out of here by this evening." "What about the rest of us?" Marcus asked. Jack was quiet for a moment, consulting his maps and checking his GPS position. "Honestly, I'm inclined to evacuate the entire group. We've got a persistent bear showing increasing interest in our activities, difficult terrain ahead, and now a medical emergency. The smart thing to do is call it here and get everyone back to safety." Tyler felt a crushing sense of disappointment, but he knew Jack was right. They'd pushed their luck as far as they could, and continuing would be reckless rather than adventurous. "Let's do it," Tyler said finally. "Brandon's safety is more important than finishing the trip." Jack nodded and began setting up the satellite communicator to call for emergency evacuation. Within minutes, he was speaking to rescue coordinators in Kodiak, explaining their situation and providing their exact GPS coordinates. "They'll have a helicopter here in about 4 hours, Jack announced after completing the radio call. "We need to find a suitable landing zone and prepare for evacuation." The next few hours were spent in careful preparation for the rescue operation. Jack scouted the area and found a small meadow about half a mile from their current position that would serve as a helicopter landing zone. They helped Brandon to the site and set up a comfortable area where he could rest while they waited. Tyler found himself sitting beside Brandon, both of them staring up at the clear blue sky and waiting for the sound of rotor blades that would end their wilderness adventure. "I'm sorry," Brandon said quietly. "I know this isn't how you wanted the trip to end." "Don't apologize," Tyler replied. "You didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes things just don't work out the way you plan them." "I should have been honest about the foot injury from the beginning," Brandon continued. "If I'd spoken up earlier, maybe we could have dealt with it before it became serious." Tyler considered that. Brandon was probably right. If they'd treated the injury properly in the early stages, it might not have progressed to the point where evacuation was necessary. But Tyler also understood the social pressure that had kept Brandon quiet, the desire not to be seen as weak or the person who ruined everyone else's adventure. "We're all learning," Tyler said finally. "This whole trip has been about pushing our limits and discovering what we're capable of. You found your limit. There's no shame in that." The sound of the helicopter became audible long before the aircraft came into view, a distant mechanical drone that gradually grew louder as it approached their position. When it finally appeared over the tree line, Tyler was struck by how small and fragile it looked against the vast backdrop of wilderness. The evacuation itself was surprisingly quick and efficient. The helicopter crew consisted of 2 pilots and a paramedic who immediately took charge of Brandon's care. Within minutes, they'd assessed his injury, provided pain medication, and prepared him for transport. "What about the rest of you?" the paramedic asked Jack. "Are you continuing with the expedition?" "No, we're all going back," Jack replied. "Too many factors stacking up against us." Tyler felt a mix of relief and disappointment as they loaded their gear into the helicopter. Relief that Brandon would get proper medical care, that they'd all made it through their wilderness experience without serious injury, that they'd proven they could handle significant challenges. But also disappointment that they hadn't completed what they'd set out to do, that their great adventure was ending with a medical evacuation rather than triumphant success. As the helicopter lifted off and Afognak Island fell away beneath them, Tyler took one last look at the wilderness they were leaving behind. Somewhere down there, a massive brown bear was probably investigating their abandoned campsite, finding the scent traces they'd left behind and adding them to his growing understanding of these strange, 2-legged visitors. "At least we'll have some stories to tell," Marcus said, raising his voice over the engine noise. Tyler nodded, but he was already thinking about next time, because despite everything, the challenges, the fear, the early end to their trip, he knew there would be a next time. The wilderness had gotten into his blood in a way that he hadn't expected, and he was already planning his return. The helicopter touched down at Kodiak Airport just as the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded Tyler of their brief time camping beside the ocean. As they unloaded their gear and said goodbye to Jack, Tyler felt like he was returning from a different world. "Take care of that foot," Jack said to Brandon as the paramedics prepared to transport him to the hospital, "and don't feel bad about how things ended. You guys did great out there." Tyler shook Jack's hand, surprised by how much he'd come to respect and trust the guide over their few days together. "Thank you for keeping us safe," he said, "and for showing us what we're capable of." "That's what it's all about," Jack replied. "Pushing limits, learning about yourself, gaining respect for the natural world. You guys accomplished all of that, even if you didn't finish the complete route." As their group gathered in the airport terminal to wait for their flight back to Anchorage, Tyler reflected on everything they'd experienced. They'd hiked through pristine wilderness, seen incredible wildlife, overcome physical challenges they'd never faced before, and learned valuable lessons about preparation, teamwork, and respect for nature. They'd also learned about their own limitations and the importance of making smart decisions when those limitations were reached. Brandon's injury and the persistent bear had forced them to confront the reality that wilderness adventure always carried genuine risks, and that managing those risks required constant vigilance and good judgment. "So," Jessica said as they settled in for the wait, "anyone interested in planning the next trip?" Tyler looked around at his friends, tired, dirty, but somehow more confident and self-aware than they'd been a week earlier, and felt a surge of anticipation for whatever adventures lay ahead. But as Tyler Johnson would discover exactly 11 months later, the wilderness of Alaska held experiences far beyond anything they had encountered on their first abbreviated expedition. The lessons they'd learned about respect, preparation, and recognizing limitations would prove insufficient when they returned to Afognak Island for what Tyler envisioned as redemption, a completion of the journey they'd been forced to abandon. The bear that had shown such persistent interest in their camp during that first trip had spent the intervening months growing larger and more dominant in his territory. The tracks they'd found, the claw marks on their bear containers, the midnight investigations of their campsite, all of these had been the behavior of a mature male establishing his authority over a piece of prime real estate. By the time Tyler convinced his friends to return to Alaska for a second attempt, that bear had grown from an estimated 1,000-pound adult to a massive 1,200-pound alpha male in his prime. The creature that had been curious about their first camp had evolved into something far more dangerous, a bear that had learned to associate human presence with food sources and had developed the patience and intelligence to overcome the obstacles humans placed between him and what he wanted. Tyler's insistence on returning to prove they could complete what they'd started would set in motion a series of events that would test every lesson they'd learned about wilderness survival and reveal the true meaning of being a guest in predator territory where human rules and expectations meant nothing at all. The planning for their return trip began almost immediately after their evacuation from Afognak Island. Despite the challenges and early termination of their first expedition, Tyler found himself obsessed with the idea of going back and completing what they'd started. The unfinished nature of their adventure gnawed at him through the remaining months of his senior year and into the summer after graduation. "I can't stop thinking about it," Tyler confessed to Marcus during one of their regular post-graduation meetups at their favorite Phoenix sports bar. "We were so close to finishing the full route. If it hadn't been for Brandon's injury and that persistent bear, we would have made it." Marcus nodded, though Tyler could see some hesitation in his friend's eyes. "It was definitely an incredible experience," Marcus agreed. "But are you sure you want to go back? I mean, we learned a lot about ourselves and proved we could handle serious wilderness challenges. Isn't that enough?" "But we didn't finish," Tyler insisted. "We had to be rescued." "That's not how I want the story to end." Over the following months, Tyler gradually convinced most of the original group to commit to a second expedition. Jessica was immediately enthusiastic, her Minnesota outdoors background making her eager for another chance at Alaska's challenges. David, ever analytical, was interested in applying the lessons they'd learned from their first attempt. Sarah and Andrew agreed to return, though Andrew remained somewhat reluctant about the physical demands. The twins, Carlos and Emma, were divided. Carlos was eager to return, but Emma had developed some anxiety about wilderness camping after their bear encounters. Eventually, she agreed to participate, but insisted on bringing additional safety equipment, including a more powerful satellite communicator and extra bear spray. Brandon, not surprisingly, declined to participate in a second expedition. His foot injury had required several months of physical therapy, and the experience had soured him on wilderness adventure. "You guys are crazy to go back there," he told Tyler during one of their conversations. "That place tried to kill us. Why give it another chance?" Tyler understood Brandon's perspective, but he couldn't shake the feeling that their first trip had been incomplete, that they owed it to themselves to prove they could successfully complete a challenging wilderness expedition without requiring rescue. Dr. Rebecca Chen, their former environmental science professor, was more supportive of a return trip than Tyler had expected. When he approached her for advice about planning a second expedition, she surprised him with her enthusiasm. "Failure is often the best teacher, Doctor," Chen said during their meeting in her office, which remained as cluttered with rock samples and wildlife photographs as Tyler remembered. "The fact that you encountered challenges and had to adapt your plans doesn't diminish what you accomplished, but if you feel compelled to return and complete the full route, that's a valid educational goal as well." Dr. Chen helped them contact Jack Kowalski again, and Tyler was relieved when the guide agreed to lead a second expedition. Jack's experience and calm professionalism had been crucial to keeping them safe during their first trip, and Tyler couldn't imagine attempting a return without him. "I'm willing to take you back," Jack said during their planning call, "but we're going to do things differently this time. More conservative route planning, better weather windows, and no one with pre-existing injuries or physical limitations. This isn't about proving toughness, it's about smart wilderness travel." The second expedition was planned for May 2024. Almost exactly 1 year after their first attempt. The timing would put them in Alaska during late spring, when weather conditions were generally favorable and wildlife activity was predictable. They would follow a modified version of their original route, avoiding some of the more challenging terrain that had contributed to Brandon's injury. Tyler spent the months leading up to the trip in intensive physical preparation. He joined a gym, hired a personal trainer, and spent weekends hiking in the mountains outside Phoenix, carrying a weighted pack. Marcus followed a similar training regimen, and both men felt significantly more prepared than they had been for their first expedition. "This time is going to be different," Tyler told Marcus, as they completed a training hike in the McDowell Mountains. "We know what to expect, we're in better shape, and we have experience dealing with the challenges." What Tyler didn't know was that the bear they'd encountered during their first trip had also spent the intervening year learning and adapting. The massive male brown bear that had investigated their campsites so persistently had claimed an even larger territory, had grown heavier and more powerful, and had developed increasingly sophisticated strategies for accessing human food sources. Other camping groups and research teams had reported encounters with an unusually large and persistent bear in the Afognak Island area throughout the fall and winter of 2023. Wildlife authorities had received multiple reports of a bear that showed little fear of humans and demonstrated remarkable problem-solving abilities when it came to accessing stored food. But none of this information filtered down to Tyler and his friends as they planned their return expedition. They were focused on their own preparation and excited about the prospect of redemption adventure, unaware that they would be returning to territory now firmly claimed by a predator that had learned to see humans as sources of food rather than threats to be avoided. The group that assembled at Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport on May 13, 2024, was smaller but more experienced than the previous year's expedition. Tyler and Marcus looked noticeably fitter and more confident. Jessica had spent the winter developing her wilderness photography skills and carried upgraded camera equipment. David had completed a wilderness first aid course and obtained his emergency medical technician certification. Sarah and Andrew had both improved their hiking fitness and felt more prepared for the physical challenges ahead. Carlos and Emma arrived with what looked like enough gear for a month-long expedition. Emma had clearly taken the safety preparations seriously, carrying multiple communication devices, extra batteries for everything, and enough bear spray to equip a small army. "Better safe than sorry," Emma said when Tyler commented on the amount of gear she was carrying. "I don't want to be caught unprepared if we run into our furry friend again." Jack met them at the Kodiak airport, looking exactly as Tyler remembered, weathered, competent, and radiating the kind of calm confidence that came from years of experience in challenging environments. But Tyler thought he detected a note of caution in the guide's manner that hadn't been present during their first expedition. "Good to see you all again," Jack said as they gathered their gear. "I trust everyone's been training and preparing for this trip?" There was a chorus of affirmatives, and Jack nodded approvingly. "Excellent. I want to be clear about something from the start. This expedition is going to follow strict safety protocols at all times. We learned some valuable lessons from last year's challenges, and we're going to apply all of them." Captain Morrison was also back to fly them to Afognak Island, and she greeted the returning group with genuine warmth. "You kids couldn't stay away, could you?" she said with a grin. "Well, I'm glad to see you're giving it another shot. Alaska has a way of getting into your blood." The flight to Afognak Island was smoother than Tyler remembered, with clear skies and excellent visibility providing spectacular views of the coastline and interior forests. As they approached the same gravel landing strip they'd used the previous year, Tyler felt his excitement building to an almost unbearable level. "This time we're going to nail it," he said to Marcus as they prepared for landing. "Full route, no problems, no early evacuation." Marcus nodded, but Tyler noticed his friend scanning the forest below with more wariness than enthusiasm. "Just remember what Jack said about safety protocols," Marcus replied. "Adventure is great, but getting home in one piece is even better." The landing and initial gear organization went smoothly, with everyone demonstrating the experience they'd gained from their previous expedition. Loading packs, checking equipment, and organizing group gear took half the time it had required the year before. Jack conducted the same safety briefing he'd given during their first trip, but Tyler noticed that he spent significantly more time on bear safety protocols and emergency procedures. The guide's emphasis on caution was more pronounced, his warnings more specific and detailed. "I want to be absolutely clear about something," Jack said as they prepared to begin hiking. "Bear activity in this area has increased significantly over the past year. We've had multiple reports of encounters with an unusually large and persistent individual that shows little fear of humans. We're going to be extra vigilant about food storage, campsite selection, and noise discipline." Tyler felt a chill of recognition. "Do you think it's the same bear we encountered last year?" "It's possible," Jack replied. "Bears have excellent memories and strong territorial instincts. If the same individual is still active in this area, he might remember your previous presence and be more likely to investigate your activities." The thought that they might be returning to face the same massive predator that had forced their early evacuation was both terrifying and oddly thrilling. Tyler found himself hoping they would encounter the bear again, under more controlled circumstances, so he could see firsthand the animal that had dominated his thoughts for the past year. Their first day's hike followed the same route they'd used during the previous expedition, 6 miles from the landing strip to their base camp beside the stream. But everything felt different this time. Tyler was stronger and more confident, the pack weight felt manageable, and the technical challenges that had seemed so daunting the year before now felt routine. "This is way easier than I remembered," Jessica said, as they paused for a rest break at the steep, rocky slope that had challenged them so much during their first trip. "Experience makes all the difference," David replied, carefully picking his way up the loose stones with techniques he'd learned from their previous attempt. Even the stream crossing that had resulted in Brandon's hypothermic dunking was completed without incident, with everyone demonstrating improved technique and confidence on the slippery rocks. They reached their first campsite in the early afternoon, giving them plenty of time to set up camp properly and organize their gear. The clearing looked exactly as Tyler remembered it. The same flat spaces for tents, the same crystal-clear stream, the same ring of towering spruces surrounding the meadow. But something felt different about the place. Tyler couldn't identify exactly what had changed, but there was an atmosphere of watchfulness, of being observed, that hadn't been present during their first visit. "Does this place feel different to you?" Emma asked as she set up her tent, echoing Tyler's own thoughts. "Different how?" Sarah replied, looking around the campsite with professional ranch girl alertness. "I don't know, like we're being watched or something." Jack had been conducting his usual inspection of the bear containers and campsite perimeter, but he stopped to look at Emma with sharp attention. "What specifically feels different? Any sounds, smells, visual signs?" Emma shrugged uncertainly. "Nothing specific. Just a feeling." Jack nodded thoughtfully. "Trust your instincts out here. Our subconscious often picks up on environmental cues before our conscious mind processes them. Everyone stay alert tonight." As evening approached, and they gathered around the fire ring for dinner, Tyler found himself frequently scanning the forest around their campsite. Every shadow seemed to hold potential movement. Every sound from the underbrush drew his immediate attention. "You're making me nervous with all that looking around," Marcus said quietly, as they shared camp food that tasted significantly better than Tyler remembered from their first trip. "Sorry," Tyler replied. "I just can't shake the feeling that we're not alone out here." "We're never alone out here," Jack said, overhearing the conversation. "This forest is full of wildlife, and most of it is aware of our presence long before we're aware of theirs. The key is distinguishing between normal wildlife activity and potentially dangerous situations." As if summoned by Jack's words, a sound echoed through the forest that made everyone freeze with recognition. It was the same low, rumbling vocalization they'd heard during their previous expedition, the unmistakable call of a large brown bear. But this time, the sound was different, more powerful, more resonant, carrying a note of authority and dominance that hadn't been present in the previous year's encounters, and it was close, much closer than the bear calls they'd heard during their first trip. "Well," Jack said quietly, his hand moving instinctively to the bear spray on his belt, "I think we're about to find out if our friend from last year remembers us." Tyler felt his heart racing with a mixture of excitement and fear as the sound echoed through the forest again, followed by the unmistakable noise of something large moving through the underbrush toward their campsite. Their second expedition was about to face its first major test, and Tyler had the unsettling feeling that this encounter was going to be very different from anything they'd experienced during their previous visit to Afognak Island. The investigation of their campsite that began shortly after sunset on May 14, 2024, was markedly different from the cautious reconnaissance they'd experienced during their first expedition. Where the previous year's bear encounters had been characterized by stealth and curiosity, this felt more like a deliberate assertion of territorial dominance. Tyler lay in his tent beside Marcus, listening to sounds that were both familiar and terrifyingly new. The heavy footsteps circling their campsite were more confident than before, moving without the hesitation or caution they'd remembered. The breathing was deeper, more powerful, suggesting an animal that had grown significantly larger in the intervening months. "This doesn't sound like the same behavior as last year," Marcus whispered, his voice tight with tension. Tyler had to agree. The bear seemed to be conducting a methodical inspection of their entire campsite, spending time at each tent, investigating every piece of equipment, and showing particular interest in the bear-resistant food containers. The sound of metal scraping against rock came from the direction of their food storage, followed by frustrated huffing and what sounded like increasingly aggressive attempts to access the containers. Unlike the previous year, when the bear had eventually given up and moved on, this investigation seemed to be escalating rather than winding down. "Jack," Tyler called out quietly, "this seems more intense than before." "I know," came Jack's immediate response. "Everyone stay in your tents and stay calm. Don't make any noise unless I specifically ask you to." For the next hour, they listened to the sound of their campsite being systematically investigated by something that was clearly much larger and more powerful than anything they'd encountered during their first expedition. At one point, Tyler was certain he heard one of the bear containers being lifted and moved, something that should have been impossible given the weight and design of the storage units. The most unsettling moment came when the investigation stopped directly outside Tyler and Marcus's tent. They could hear heavy breathing, just inches from the thin nylon wall that separated them from roughly 1,200 pounds of apex predator. The sound was so close that Tyler could feel the warmth of the bear's breath through the fabric. Neither man dared to move or even breathe deeply as the massive animal conducted what felt like a personal inspection of their tent. After what seemed like an eternity, the breathing moved away, but Tyler remained frozen with terror for long minutes afterward. When the sounds finally faded into the distance, Jack waited nearly 30 minutes before emerging from his tent to assess the situation. What he found clearly disturbed him more than anything they'd experienced during their previous expedition. "This bear is displaying completely different behavior," Jack announced grimly as they gathered around the remains of their fire the next morning. "Last year he was curious but ultimately respectful of barriers. Last night he was testing defenses and showing signs of problem-solving behavior that's way beyond normal bear intelligence." Tyler examined the evidence of their nocturnal visitor with growing unease. The bear containers had indeed been moved, not just rolled or pushed, but actually lifted and repositioned in ways that demonstrated incredible strength. Deep claw marks scored the metal surfaces, and one container showed signs of bite marks from teeth that must have been enormous. "How much bigger do you think he's gotten?" David asked, measuring the new claw marks against those from their previous encounter. "Based on the track size and the depth of these marks, I'd estimate he's gained at least 200 pounds since last year," Jack replied. "We're looking at a mature male in his prime, probably somewhere around 1,200 pounds. The implications of that size estimate hit Tyler like a physical blow. They'd thought they were returning to face the same challenge they'd overcome before, but instead they were dealing with an animal that had grown into something even more formidable. "What does this mean for our safety?" Sarah asked, her nursing background making her focus immediately on risk assessment. Jack was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with a difficult decision. "Honestly, it means we need to seriously consider aborting this expedition and calling for evacuation." "No," Tyler said immediately, the word coming out more forcefully than he'd intended. "We can't quit again. We came here to finish what we started." "Tyler," Jack said patiently, "this isn't about quitting or finishing. This is about managing acceptable risk levels. A bear that size showing this level of interest in our camp represents a genuine safety threat." But Tyler could feel the familiar determination rising in him, the same stubborn refusal to accept defeat that had driven him to plan this return expedition in the first place. They'd spent a year preparing for this moment, training physically and mentally to overcome the challenges that had forced their early evacuation. To quit now, before they'd even completed their first full day, felt like admitting that they were fundamentally incapable of succeeding in the wilderness. "Let's give it another day," Tyler argued. "If he comes back tonight with the same level of persistence, then we'll reconsider. But maybe last night was just his way of re-establishing territorial boundaries. Maybe now that he's reminded us who's in charge, he'll back off." Tyler could see the skepticism in Jack's eyes, but the guide eventually agreed to continue with the expedition while maintaining heightened alertness and readiness for immediate evacuation if necessary. The rest of their second day followed their planned itinerary, with a day hike to the same waterfall they'd visited during their first expedition. But the magical quality of their previous visit was overshadowed by a constant sense of being watched and evaluated by unseen eyes. "I keep feeling like something's following us," Emma said as they paused for lunch beside the thundering cascade. "Every time I turn around, I expect to see him standing there watching us." Tyler understood exactly what she meant. Throughout the day's hike, he'd caught glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision that disappeared when he looked directly. Sounds in the forest seemed muffled and distorted, as if normal wildlife activity was being suppressed by the presence of a dominant predator. Even Jack seemed more tense than usual, frequently checking their back trail and scanning the forest around them with professional alertness that suggested genuine concern rather than routine caution. "Are we making a mistake being here?" Andrew asked quietly as they prepared to return to their campsite. It was a question Tyler had been trying not to ask himself. Their first expedition, despite ending in evacuation, had felt like a genuine adventure with manageable risks. This return trip felt different, more like they were intruding on territory claimed by something that had no intention of tolerating their presence. But Tyler's determination to complete what they'd started overrode his growing apprehension. They'd come too far and invested too much preparation to abandon their goal at the first sign of challenge. Their second night in camp began ominously, with the now familiar sound of their massive neighbor announcing his presence well before sunset. But this time, the vocalization seemed different, less investigative and more like warnings or challenges. "He's telling us he doesn't want us here," Jack said as they gathered around their fire for what might be their last evening meal in the wilderness. "Are you seriously suggesting that Bear is capable of that level of communication?" David asked, his scientific skepticism warring with growing nervousness. "I'm suggesting that bears are much more intelligent than most people realize," Jack replied. "They have complex social structures, excellent memories, and sophisticated problem-solving abilities. An animal this size and age didn't survive to reach sexual maturity by being stupid." As darkness fell, their visitor began his second night of campsite investigation, but this time his behavior was markedly more aggressive. The sounds of frustrated huffing and increasingly violent attempts to breach their food storage were accompanied by vocalizations that could only be described as angry. Tyler found himself lying rigid in his sleeping bag, listening to what sounded like a massive animal systematically testing every aspect of their campsite defenses. At one point, he was certain he heard their picnic table being overturned, followed by the crash of something heavy being thrown against a tree. "This is escalating beyond normal bear behavior," Jack's voice carried clearly through the darkness. "Everyone be ready to implement emergency evacuation procedures if I give the signal." But Tyler was determined not to let fear drive them away from their goal again. They'd faced bear encounters during their first expedition and had managed them successfully. This situation was more intense, but it was still manageable if they maintained proper protocols and didn't panic. The investigation continued for nearly 3 hours, during which Tyler heard sounds that defied his understanding of what bears were supposed to be capable of. It sounded like their visitor was actively trying to problem-solve his way past human-designed barriers, testing different approaches and adapting his strategy based on the results. When morning came, the campsite looked like it had been hit by a natural disaster. Equipment that had been properly secured was scattered across the clearing. The bear containers remained intact but showed dramatic new damage, including bite marks that had actually penetrated the outer metal shell in several places. "I've never seen anything like this," Jack said as he surveyed the destruction. "This level of persistent, intelligent problem-solving behavior is completely outside normal parameters for bear encounters." Tyler stared at the evidence of their visitor's capabilities and felt his confidence wavering for the first time since planning their return expedition. They weren't dealing with a normal bear encounter. They were facing something that seemed almost supernaturally determined to access their food stores. "We need to leave," Emma said, her voice shaking slightly. "This thing isn't going to stop until it gets what it wants." "Maybe she's right," Marcus said, looking at Tyler with obvious concern. "This feels like we're in way over our heads." Tyler felt the weight of leadership pressing down on him. He'd been the driving force behind this expedition, the one who'd convinced everyone to return to Alaska for a second attempt. If they evacuated again, he would bear responsibility for putting his friends through a terrifying experience for no real purpose. But as he studied the destruction around their campsite and considered the escalating aggression they'd witnessed over 2 nights, Tyler began to realize that his determination to complete their planned route might be placing everyone in genuine danger. "One more night," Tyler said finally, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "If he comes back with the same intensity tonight, we'll call for evacuation first thing tomorrow morning." Jack looked like he wanted to argue, but eventually nodded. "One more night, but we're implementing enhanced safety protocols. No one leaves their tent for any reason after dark. Everyone sleeps with bear spray within arm's reach, and if I say it's time to go, we go immediately, no discussion." Tyler agreed to the conditions, but privately, he was already planning arguments for why they should continue with their expedition, even if the bear returned. They'd come too far to quit now, and he was convinced that persistence and proper protocols would eventually allow them to coexist with their massive neighbor. What Tyler didn't understand was that the bear they were dealing with had spent the intervening year learning to associate human presence with food sources. Other camping groups and research teams that had visited Afognak Island had inadvertently reinforced this association through small failures in food storage and waste management. The massive male brown bear now saw humans not as threats to be avoided, but as sources of high-quality food that were worth significant effort to access. Tyler's determination to prove they could complete their wilderness challenge was about to collide with 1,200 pounds of apex predator that had learned to see them as prey rather than competitors for territory. The lessons they'd learned about bear safety during their first expedition were based on normal bear behavior, but nothing about their current situation was normal. As they settled in for their 3rd night on Afognak Island, Tyler Johnson had no way of knowing that he was about to become the central figure in one of the most tragic wilderness encounters in Alaska's recorded history. May 15th, 2024, dawned with an eerie calm that should have been more unsettling than the aggressive bear activity of the previous 2 nights. Tyler woke to complete silence. No bird songs, no rustling in the underbrush, none of the normal sounds of forest wildlife that had provided the soundtrack for their first expedition. "It's too quiet," Marcus said as they emerged from their tent to find their campsite undisturbed for the first time since arriving on the island. Jack was already up and conducting his morning inspection, but his expression was troubled rather than relieved. "This kind of silence usually means there's a major predator in the immediate area," he said. "All the smaller animals have gone to ground." Tyler felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. During their first expedition, they'd awakened to bird songs and the sounds of normal forest activity. This oppressive quiet felt like the entire ecosystem was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. "Maybe he's moved on," Jessica suggested hopefully as she documented the undisturbed campsite with her camera. "Maybe he finally lost interest and found something else to focus on." But Jack was shaking his head. Bears don't just lose interest when they've shown this level of persistence. He's still out there, probably watching us right now. The question is why he changed his approach. As they prepared breakfast and broke camp for the day's hiking, Tyler found himself constantly scanning the forest around them. The feeling of being observed was stronger than ever, but now it felt more like being stalked than simply watched. Every shadow seemed to conceal a massive form. Every rustle of vegetation made him reach instinctively for the bear spray on his belt. Their planned route for the day would take them away from their base camp and deeper into the island's interior, following a challenging trail to their second campsite near the coast. It was supposed to be their longest and most difficult hiking day, covering nearly 10 miles of varied terrain, including stream crossings, steep climbs, and dense forest travel. "We're going to move in tighter formation today," Jack announced as they shouldered their packs. "No one gets more than 20 yards ahead or behind the person in front of them. We stop and regroup every hour, and everyone maintains noise discipline. Enough sound to avoid surprising wildlife, but not so much that we can't hear what's happening around us." The change in Jack's demeanor was obvious to everyone. Where he'd been cautiously professional during their first expedition, now he seemed genuinely worried about their safety. Tyler noticed that the guide kept his hand near his bear spray at all times and checked his GPS position more frequently than seemed necessary. The first hour of hiking passed without incident, following a well-defined trail through old-growth forest that felt familiar from their previous expedition. But as they moved deeper into the island's interior, the trail became fainter and the terrain more challenging. It was during their second hourly rest stop that Carlos made an observation that sent ice through Tyler's veins. "Has anyone else noticed that we're being followed?" Carlos asked quietly, pointing back toward the trail they'd just covered. Tyler looked where Carlos was indicating and saw nothing but dense forest and dappled shadows. But as he stared, he began to make out what Carlos had spotted. Subtle signs of disturbance in the vegetation beside the trail, as if something large had been paralleling their route while staying just out of sight. "How long have you been seeing this?" Jack asked, immediately moving to examine the signs Carlos had identified. "About 30 minutes, Carlos replied. "At first I thought I was imagining it, but the pattern's been consistent. Something's definitely pacing us." Jack studied the disturbed vegetation with professional thoroughness, and Tyler could see his expression growing more grim by the minute. "These are fresh," Jack said finally. "Very fresh, and they're from something big." The realization that their massive neighbor had been following them, staying parallel to their route while remaining invisible in the dense undergrowth, transformed the day's hike from an adventure into something approaching a nightmare. Tyler found himself fighting the urge to look over his shoulder every few steps, knowing that somewhere in the forest behind them, 1,200 pounds of apex predator was tracking their movements with calculated patience. "What's his plan?" David asked, his analytical mind trying to process the bear's behavior in logical terms. "Hard to say," Jack replied. "He might just be curious about where we're going. Or he might be waiting for us to make a mistake, get separated, or show weakness." "Waiting for us to make a mistake, how?" Sarah asked, her nursing background making her think immediately about potential injuries or medical emergencies. Jack was quiet for a moment, clearly wrestling with how much information to share. "Bears are opportunistic predators," he said finally. "If one of us got injured, separated from the group, or showed signs of distress, it might trigger his hunting instincts." The implications of that statement hit Tyler like a physical blow. They weren't just being followed by a curious bear, they were being stalked by a predator that was evaluating them as potential prey. "Maybe we should turn back," Emma said, her voice tight with fear. "Go back to the base camp and call for evacuation." Tyler felt the familiar surge of stubborn determination rising in him, warring with the growing evidence that they were in serious danger. They'd come too far to quit now, invested too much time and preparation to abandon their goal at the first real sign of challenge. "We keep going," Tyler said firmly. "We're only a few hours from our next campsite. Once we're there, we can reassess the situation and decide whether to continue or call for pickup." Jack looked like he wanted to argue, but he eventually nodded. "We continue, but we modify our approach. Tighter formation, more frequent stops, and everyone stays alert. If anyone sees or hears anything unusual, speak up immediately. The next 3 hours of hiking were among the most stressful Tyler had ever experienced. Every sound from the forest drew immediate attention from the entire group. Every shadow seemed to conceal a massive predator. The normal challenges of wilderness hiking, stream crossings, steep climbs, navigation decisions, became secondary to the constant awareness that they were being hunted. The most terrifying moment came during a particularly challenging creek crossing, where they had to traverse fast-moving water on slippery rocks while carrying heavy packs. As Tyler helped Jessica navigate the treacherous footing, he caught a glimpse of movement in his peripheral vision that made his blood freeze. Standing on a ridge about 200 yards away, partially concealed by forest shadows, but clearly visible, was the largest bear Tyler had ever seen. The animal was massive beyond anything he'd imagined, easily as tall as a horse when standing on all fours, with a head that seemed impossibly broad and powerful. Even at a distance, the bear's physical presence was overwhelming, radiating strength and dominance that made Tyler feel like a small, vulnerable prey animal. "Don't move!" Jack's voice was barely a whisper. "Everyone freeze exactly where you are." Tyler found himself paralyzed in the middle of the creek, cold water rushing around his legs while he stared at the massive predator evaluating them from his elevated position. The bear seemed completely unafraid, studying their group with obvious intelligence and what Tyler could only describe as calculating interest. For nearly 5 minutes, predator and prey regarded each other across the valley. Tyler could see the bear's massive head turning as it studied each member of their group individually, as if taking inventory of their capabilities and vulnerabilities. Then, without warning, the bear simply melted back into the forest, disappearing so quickly and completely that Tyler almost wondered if he'd imagined the entire encounter. "Everyone okay?" Jack asked quietly, waiting until the bear had been out of sight for several minutes before allowing the group to resume movement. There was a chorus of shaky affirmatives, but Tyler could see that the encounter had shaken everyone badly. The reality of their situation, that they were being stalked by something that could kill any of them without much effort, had finally sunk in completely. "How big do you think he was?" Marcus asked as they completed the creek crossing and regrouped on the opposite bank. 1,200 pounds minimum," Jack replied grimly. "Possibly larger. That's a mature alpha male in his prime, and he's shown no fear of humans whatsoever." "Why didn't he attack?" Andrew asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because he doesn't need to," Jack said. "He's in complete control of this situation. He can choose when and where to engage us, and he knows it." Tyler felt sick as the implications of their predicament became clear. They weren't participants in a wilderness adventure anymore. They were being hunted by an apex predator that was smarter, stronger, and more experienced in this environment than they could ever hope to be. But even faced with that reality, Tyler found himself unwilling to admit defeat. They were less than 2 hours from their planned campsite, and once they reached it, they could establish defensive positions and call for evacuation if necessary. To turn back now would mean another failed expedition, another story of defeat and rescue that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "We keep going," Tyler said, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. "We reach the campsite, set up proper defenses, and reassess from there." Jack looked like he wanted to argue, but the guide eventually nodded and shouldered his pack. 2 hours to the campsite," he said. "Then we make some serious decisions about whether to continue this expedition." What Tyler didn't know was that the bear's behavior had shifted from territorial assertion to active hunting. The massive male had identified their group as a potential food source and was now implementing the same patient stalking strategies he used when hunting deer or other natural prey. The bear had learned from other human encounters that groups could be dangerous when they remained together and alert, but individuals separated from the group were much more vulnerable. He was waiting for an opportunity, someone to fall behind, someone to make a mistake, someone to show the kind of weakness that would trigger his predatory instincts. As Tyler Johnson led his friends deeper into the wilderness of Afognak Island, that opportunity was less than 2 hours away. The combination of challenging terrain, accumulated fatigue, and the psychological stress of being stalked by a massive predator was about to create exactly the kind of vulnerable situation that 1,200 pounds of apex predator had been patiently waiting for. The final 2 hours of hiking to their second campsite passed in a state of hyper-alertness that left everyone mentally and physically exhausted. Tyler found himself jumping at every sound, constantly scanning the forest for signs of their stalker and struggling to maintain the positive leadership attitude that had carried them through previous challenges. Their campsite, when they finally reached it in the late afternoon, was spectacularly located on a bluff overlooking the ocean, with panoramic views of the mainland mountains across the water. Under normal circumstances, Tyler would have been thrilled by the dramatic setting and the sense of accomplishment that came from completing a challenging day's hike. But the presence of their unwanted escort had transformed what should have been a triumph into an exercise in survival. "Good sight lines in all directions," Jack observed, as he surveyed the campsite with tactical rather than aesthetic appreciation. "It'll be hard for anything to approach without being seen, but it also means we have limited escape routes if we need them." Setting up camp took on an urgency that had been absent from their previous nights. Everyone worked with focused efficiency, establishing their tents, securing gear, and organizing the bear-resistant food containers with the kind of attention to detail that comes from genuine fear. "He's still out there," Emma said quietly as she adjusted her tent stakes. "I can feel him watching us." Tyler could feel it too, a sense of malevolent attention focused on their group from somewhere in the forest below their clifftop position. Every few minutes, he caught himself scanning the tree line for any sign of movement, any indication that their stalker was positioning himself for whatever he planned to do next. As evening approached and they gathered around their firing for what might be their last meal in the wilderness, Tyler found himself studying his friends' faces in the flickering light. They all looked older somehow, marked by the stress of being hunted and the growing realization that they were completely out of their depth. "I think we should call for evacuation," David said quietly, voicing what Tyler suspected everyone was thinking. "This situation has moved beyond anything we're equipped to handle." "I agree," Sarah said immediately. "This isn't about proving ourselves anymore. This is about getting home alive." Tyler felt the familiar resistance rising in him, the stubborn refusal to accept defeat that had driven him to plan this expedition in the first place. They were less than halfway through their planned route, had overcome significant challenges to reach this point, and were about to give up at the first sign of serious difficulty. "One more night," Tyler said, trying to keep his voice steady. "If he shows up again tonight with the same level of aggression, we'll call for pickup tomorrow morning. But maybe the change of location will make a difference. Maybe he'll lose interest and move on." Jack's expression was skeptical, but he eventually nodded. "One more night, but we're implementing full defensive protocols. No one goes anywhere alone, not even to answer nature's call. Everyone sleeps with bear spray and emergency beacons within arm's reach, and we maintain watch shifts throughout the night." As they established the watch schedule and reviewed emergency procedures, Tyler found himself hoping desperately that their stalker would simply disappear during the night, allowing them to complete their expedition without further incident. But deep down, he suspected that their encounter with the massive brown bear was far from over. The attack, when it came shortly after 2 a.m. on May 16, 2024, was unlike anything any of them could have imagined. Tyler was awakening from an uneasy sleep when the screaming started. At first, his drowsy mind couldn't process what he was hearing. High-pitched sounds of terror and pain that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then Marcus was shaking him, shouting something about getting out of the tent, and Tyler's consciousness snapped into crystal clarity. Outside their tent, chaos had erupted across the campsite. Tyler could hear Jack shouting commands, the metallic hiss of bear spray being deployed, and beneath it all, the most terrifying sound he'd ever heard, the deep, aggressive vocalizations of an enraged brown bear that had finally decided to stop stalking and start hunting. Tyler unzipped his tent and emerged into a nightmare. The massive bear was in the middle of their campsite, larger and more terrifying than anything Tyler's worst fears had conjured. Standing on his hind legs, the animal towered nearly 10 feet tall, his enormous paws swiping at the air as he tried to reach someone Tyler couldn't immediately see. "Tyler!" The scream came from somewhere behind the bear, and Tyler realized with horror that one of his friends was trapped between the massive predator and the edge of the cliff. The voice was high-pitched with terror, but Tyler couldn't immediately identify who was in danger. Jack was advancing on the bear with a canister of bear spray, shouting at the top of his lungs in an attempt to drive the animal away from whoever was cornered. But the bear seemed completely unafraid of the noise and the spray, focused entirely on the prey he had isolated from the group. Tyler's training and preparation abandoned him completely. Every bear safety protocol they'd learned fled from his mind as he watched the massive predator stalking one of his friends. All he could think about was getting to whoever was in danger, even though he had no plan and no realistic hope of fighting something that weighed 10 times as much as he did. "Get away from him!" Tyler heard himself screaming as he rushed toward the bear, his own canister of bear spray in his hand, but forgotten in the adrenaline surge of pure panic. The bear's attention swung toward Tyler with predatory focus, and for a moment that seemed to last forever, Tyler found himself staring into the intelligent, calculating eyes of an apex predator that had already decided he was food. The animal's massive head was easily twice the size of Tyler's entire torso, and his teeth were like ivory daggers designed for cutting through flesh and crushing bone. Then the bear was moving, dropping to all fours and charging with speed that defied his enormous size. Tyler had a single moment to understand that his impulsive attempt at rescue had just signed his own death warrant before 1,200 pounds of muscle and fury slammed into him with the force of a runaway truck. The impact drove Tyler backward off his feet, his bear spray flying uselessly into the darkness as massive claws raked across his chest and shoulders. Pain exploded through his body as razor-sharp talons sliced through his clothing and into the flesh beneath, but the adrenaline flooding his system prevented him from fully processing the extent of his injuries. Tyler's last coherent thought before the bear's jaws clamped down on his left shoulder was a desperate hope that his sacrifice would give the others time to escape. He could hear his friends screaming his name, could hear Jack shouting commands, could hear the sound of people running through the darkness. Then the massive jaws tightened, and Tyler's world exploded into agony beyond anything he'd ever imagined possible. The bear's teeth punched through muscle and scraped against bone, sending shockwaves of pain through his entire nervous system. He tried to scream, but found that he couldn't draw enough breath, couldn't coordinate his diaphragm muscles, couldn't do anything but endure the overwhelming sensation of being torn apart by something infinitely stronger than himself. The bear began to shake him like a dog worrying a toy, and Tyler felt his left shoulder separate with a wet, tearing sound that he felt more than heard. His arm went completely numb, and he realized with detached clinical awareness that the bear had probably severed major nerves and blood vessels. Through the haze of pain and shock, Tyler could hear his friends screaming his name, could hear the hiss of bear spray being deployed, could hear Jack shouting something about emergency beacons and evacuation. But the sounds seemed to be coming from very far away, as if he was listening to them from the bottom of a deep well. The bear released his shoulder and repositioned for a better grip, and Tyler found himself looking up at the massive predator's face from a distance of inches. The animal's eyes held an intelligence that was almost human, but completely without mercy or hesitation. This wasn't random animal aggression. This was a calculated predator, methodically killing prey that had made the mistake of entering his territory. Tyler tried to fight back, tried to reach for the hunting knife on his belt or the bear spray that was somewhere in the darkness, but his left arm wouldn't respond to his commands, and his right arm felt like it was moving through thick liquid. The blood loss was beginning to affect his coordination and consciousness, making everything seem distant and unreal. The bear's massive paw pressed down on Tyler's chest, easily pinning him to the ground, while claws that were longer than Tyler's fingers punctured his sternum and the soft tissue of his abdomen. Tyler could feel his ribs cracking under the pressure, could feel internal organs shifting in ways they were never meant to move. "Help me!" Tyler managed to scream, the words coming out as barely recognizable sounds through vocal cords that were damaged and airways that were filling with blood. "Somebody help me!" But even as he called for help, Tyler understood with terrible clarity that he was beyond saving. The bear had inflicted massive trauma to vital organs and major blood vessels. Even if his friends could somehow drive the predator away, even if a trauma team materialized in the wilderness, the damage was too extensive for survival. The last thing Tyler Johnson saw before consciousness finally abandoned him was the massive bear's head descending toward his throat, jaws open to deliver the killing bite that would end his 22 years of life in the wilderness he had loved so much and understood so little. The sounds that followed Tyler's final scream would haunt his surviving friends for the rest of their lives. The wet, tearing noises of a massive predator feeding, the crack of bones being crushed, the gradually diminishing sounds of struggle as Tyler's body finally stopped fighting against the inevitable. Marcus Rivera would later tell investigators that his last clear memory before fleeing into the forest was the sight of Tyler's body disappearing into the massive bear's jaws, and the realization that his best friend had just been killed while trying to save someone else's life. Jessica Morrison would remember the way Tyler had screamed her name just before rushing toward the bear, and the crushing guilt of knowing that he had died trying to rescue her from a situation she might have been able to escape on her own. Jack Kowalski would replay those final moments thousands of times, wondering if there was anything he could have done differently, any tactical decision that might have prevented the tragedy that unfolded under his watch. But for Tyler Johnson, there would be no memories, no guilt, no endless replaying of what might have been. His adventure in the Alaskan wilderness had ended exactly as he'd always said he wanted it to, with a story that would be remembered for the rest of his friends' lives. The difference was that Tyler had always imagined it would be a story of triumph and conquest, of young people proving they could overcome any challenge through preparation, determination, and teamwork. Instead, it became a story of hubris and tragedy, of what happens when human ambition collides with the raw, unforgiving power of nature at its most fundamental level. As Tyler's friends fled into the forest, abandoning his body to the massive predator that had claimed it, they carried with them the knowledge that their friend's death could have been prevented if they had simply acknowledged their limitations and called for evacuation when the danger became obvious. But Tyler Johnson, who had dreamed of wilderness adventure since watching that documentary about Kodiak Island 2 years earlier, would never learn that lesson. His education in the realities of Alaska's wilderness had ended with 1,200 pounds of apex predator teaching him, in the most direct way possible, that nature doesn't care about human dreams, human preparation, or human determination to succeed. In the end, Tyler got exactly what he'd always said he wanted, an adventure that would be remembered for the rest of his friends' lives. The tragedy was that he wouldn't be alive to remember it with them. The chaos that followed Tyler's death was a blur of terror, confusion, and desperate survival instincts taking over rational thought. Marcus Rivera, who had been Tyler's roommate and closest friend since freshman orientation, found himself running through the dark forest without any clear destination, driven only by the primal need to put distance between himself and the sounds of the massive bear feeding on his best friend's body. Jessica Morrison, the petite blonde from Minnesota, who had been the bear's original target before Tyler's fatal intervention, stumbled through the underbrush with tears streaming down her face and Tyler's final scream echoing in her mind. The realization that he had died trying to save her created a crushing weight of survivor's guilt that would haunt her for years to come. David Park, the methodical pre-med student who had always approached problems with careful analysis and logical thinking, found that his scientific mind completely shut down in the face of witnessing his friend being torn apart by 1,200 pounds of apex predator. He followed the others blindly through the forest, his GPS training and navigation skills abandoned in favor of simple flight. Sarah Collins and Andrew Thompson stayed together as they fled, their relationship providing a small anchor of stability in the midst of absolute terror. Sarah's ranch background and nursing training told her that Tyler was beyond any help she could provide, but the knowledge didn't lessen her desperate wish that she could have done something to save him. Carlos and Emma Martinez, the twins from El Paso, moved through the darkness with the same unconscious coordination they'd shown throughout their lives. But even their deep sibling bond couldn't shield them from the trauma of watching a friend die in the most violent way imaginable. Jack Kowalski, the experienced guide who had led dozens of expeditions through Alaska's wilderness without serious incident, found himself facing the nightmare scenario that every professional guide fears most: the death of a client under his protection. His years of training and experience told him to coordinate the group's evacuation and establish communication with rescue services, but the immediacy of the threat and the chaos of the moment had overwhelmed even his professional composure. The 7 survivors crashed through the forest for nearly 2 hours before exhaustion and the realization that they were putting themselves in even greater danger by moving blindly through unfamiliar terrain in the dark finally forced them to stop. They found shelter in a dense grove of spruce trees about 3 miles from their campsite, huddling together in a tight circle, while Jack tried to establish contact with emergency services using their satellite communicator. Kodiak Search and Rescue. This is Jack Kowalski, Wilderness Guide License number 2847. Jack's voice was steady despite the circumstances, his professional training allowing him to function even in crisis. I'm reporting a fatal bear attack on Afognak Island. 1 client deceased, 7 survivors in need of immediate emergency evacuation. The response crackled through the device's small speaker with bureaucratic efficiency that seemed surreal given the horror they'd just experienced. Copy that, Mr. Kowalski. Please provide your exact GPS coordinates and the nature of the injuries to the deceased. Jack read off their position from his GPS unit while the survivors listened in stunned silence. The clinical nature of the radio conversation, fatal bear attack, 1 client deceased, and nature of injuries reduced Tyler's violent death to administrative details that needed to be processed and filed. The deceased is Tyler Matthew Johnson, age 22, from Phoenix, Arizona, Jack continued. Massive trauma from brown bear attack, definitely fatal. Survivors are shaken, but physically uninjured. We need immediate helicopter evacuation, and you'll need to coordinate with wildlife authorities for body recovery." The words "body recovery" hit Marcus like a physical blow. Less than 3 hours ago, Tyler had been his best friend and roommate, full of enthusiasm about completing their wilderness adventure. Now, he was a body that needed to be recovered from a bear that was probably still feeding on his remains. "What about Tyler?" Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. "We can't just leave him there." Jack's expression was grim in the faint light of his headlamp. "Tyler is gone," he said quietly but firmly. "There's nothing we can do for him now except get ourselves to safety and let the authorities handle the recovery. Going back to that campsite would just put more people at risk." The next several hours passed in a haze of emergency procedures and administrative necessities that seemed completely disconnected from the traumatic reality of losing a friend to a massive predator. The survivors took turns using the satellite communicator to contact their families, trying to explain through tears and shock that they were safe, but that Tyler was dead. Marcus's call to his parents was the hardest conversation he'd ever had in his life. "Tyler's gone, Mom," he sobbed into the device. "A bear killed him." He was trying to save Jessica, and the bear killed him. Jessica's call to her family in Minnesota was equally devastating. "It should have been me," she kept repeating. "Tyler died trying to save me. It should have been me." David's scientific mind kept trying to process what had happened in clinical terms, analyzing the bear's behavior and the sequence of events that had led to Tyler's death. But every time he started to think about it logically, he was overwhelmed by the memory of his friend's screams and the sound of bones being crushed. Sarah used her nursing training to assess everyone for signs of shock and hypothermia, but her professional composure cracked when she had to report Tyler's status to the emergency dispatcher. "Patient is deceased," she managed to say before breaking down completely. Andrew, who had been the most reluctant member of the group to attempt wilderness camping in Alaska, felt a crushing sense of guilt that his fears had been proven tragically correct. He'd known something like this could happen, had worried about it from the beginning, but hadn't fought hard enough to convince Tyler to abandon the expedition. Carlos and Emma held each other and cried, their shared grief amplified by the twin bond that had allowed them to communicate without words for their entire lives. They didn't need to discuss their feelings about Tyler's death. Each could feel the other's pain and survivor's guilt as if it were their own. The helicopter evacuation arrived just after dawn, the sound of rotor blades providing the first hope the survivors had felt since Tyler's death. But even rescue felt hollow when they knew that one of their group would never make it home. The flight back to Kodiak was conducted in almost complete silence, broken only by the occasional radio communication between the pilot and various emergency agencies coordinating the response. The survivors stared out the windows at the vast wilderness below, knowing that somewhere in that green expanse, Tyler's body was being investigated by wildlife officials and photographers, documenting the scene for their investigation. At Kodiak Regional Medical Center, the survivors were separated for individual medical evaluations and interviews with Alaska state troopers who needed detailed statements about the circumstances surrounding Tyler's death. The clinical environment of the hospital, with its bright lights and antiseptic smells, felt surreal after 3 days in the wilderness. Detective Lieutenant Sarah Hendricks, a 15-year veteran of the Alaska State Troopers who specialized in wilderness incidents, conducted the interviews with professional compassion but thorough attention to detail. She'd investigated dozens of bear attacks over her career, and she knew that understanding exactly what had happened was crucial for preventing similar tragedies in the future. "I need you to walk me through the events leading up to the attack," Detective Hendricks said to Marcus during his interview. "Start from when you first became aware of the bear's presence and take me through everything you remember." Marcus struggled to organize his memories into a coherent narrative. The trauma of watching his best friend die had fragmented his recollections, leaving him with vivid flashes of specific moments but difficulty connecting them into a logical sequence. "Tyler heard Jessica screaming first," Marcus said, his voice hollow with exhaustion and grief. "He got out of the tent and saw the bear had cornered her near the cliff edge. Jack was trying to drive the bear away with bear spray, but it wasn't working." "What did Tyler do next?" Detective Hendricks asked gently. "He ran toward the bear," Marcus replied, tears starting to flow again. "He was screaming at it to get away from Jessica." "I don't think he had any plan. He just saw his friend in danger and reacted." "Did Tyler deploy his bear spray?" "I don't think so. Everything happened so fast, and he was focused on getting to Jessica. The bear turned and charged him before he could do anything defensive." Detective Hendricks made notes while Marcus continued his account, occasionally asking for clarification about timing, positions, and specific actions. She'd heard similar stories before, well-meaning people who made impulsive decisions in emergency situations and paid for their heroism with their lives. Jessica's interview was even more difficult as she struggled with overwhelming guilt about Tyler's death. "He died because of me," she kept repeating. "If I hadn't gotten trapped by the bear, Tyler would still be alive." "Can you tell me how you became separated from the group?" Detective Hendricks asked. "What led to you being cornered by the bear?" Jessica's memory of those crucial moments was hazy, fragmented by trauma and the confusion of being awakened by the attack. "I heard noise outside my tent and thought someone was having trouble with equipment," she said. "I got up to see if I could help, and when I unzipped my tent, the bear was right there." "How close was the bear when you first saw it?" "Maybe 10 feet. It was huge, bigger than anything I'd ever imagined. I tried to back away toward the cliff edge, thinking I could maybe climb down or find somewhere to hide, but that just cornered me with nowhere to go." "What happened when Tyler intervened?" Jessica's voice broke completely as she recalled Tyler's final moments. "He came running from his tent, screaming at the bear to leave me alone. The bear turned toward him and it was like watching a truck hit him. Tyler never had a chance." The interviews with the other survivors followed similar patterns, each person providing pieces of the puzzle that would help investigators understand exactly how the tragedy had unfolded. But beyond the forensic value of their statements, the interviews served as a form of initial psychological processing, forcing each survivor to confront and verbalize what they had witnessed. Dr. Patricia Morales, the hospital's staff psychologist who specialized in trauma counseling, met with each survivor to begin the process of addressing the severe psychological impact of witnessing Tyler's violent death. She'd worked with survivors of bear attacks before and understood the complex mix of survivors' guilt, post-traumatic stress, and grief that they would be dealing with for months or years to come. "What you've experienced is one of the most traumatic events a person can witness," Dr. Morales explained to the group during a collective session. "Watching a friend die violently, especially someone who was trying to help others, creates psychological wounds that will take time and professional help to heal." Marcus raised his hand tentatively. "How do we deal with the guilt? Tyler died trying to save Jessica. But what if we'd done something different? What if I'd been faster getting out of my tent, or if we'd called for evacuation earlier?" "Survivor's guilt is a normal response to this kind of trauma," Dr. Morales replied. "Your minds are trying to process an incomprehensible event by finding ways you could have prevented it. But the reality is that bear attacks happen incredibly quickly, and there was probably nothing any of you could have done to change the outcome." "But we knew the bear was dangerous," David interjected. "We'd been dealing with increasingly aggressive behavior for 3 days. We should have called for evacuation before it escalated to an attack." Dr. Morales nodded sympathetically. Decision-making in wilderness situations involves balancing risks against goals, and it's always easier to see the correct choice in hindsight. What's important now is processing your grief and trauma in healthy ways, not punishing yourselves for decisions made under stress with incomplete information. While the survivors worked through their initial trauma counseling, Alaska Department of Fish and Game wildlife biologist Dr. Jennifer Walsh was leading the investigation team back to the scene of the attack. Dr. Walsh had over 20 years of experience studying brown bear behavior and had investigated dozens of human-bear conflicts throughout Alaska. The helicopter carrying the investigation team landed at the same clearing where Tyler's group had been picked up by rescue services 12 hours earlier. Dr. Walsh immediately began documenting the scene with photographic and physical evidence that would be crucial for understanding the bear's behavior and preventing similar incidents. "The attack site is about 3 miles northeast of here," Jack Kowalski told the investigation team as they prepared for the hike to the campsite. Jack had insisted on returning to guide the investigators, despite the psychological difficulty of revisiting the scene where he'd lost a client. The hike to the clifftop campsite took the investigation team through the same terrain Tyler's group had covered during their final day, but now the forest felt different, oppressive and threatening rather than adventurous. Dr. Walsh noted signs of the bear's presence throughout the area, including fresh tracks, scat, and territorial markings that indicated a large male had been actively patrolling this section of the island. "This bear has definitely established this area as part of his territory," Dr. Walsh observed as they approached the campsite. "The density of sign here suggests he's been using this corridor regularly, probably for several months." The campsite itself told a clear story of what had happened. The survivors' hasty flight had left behind scattered equipment, damaged tents, and clear evidence of the bear's attack. Most disturbing were the obvious signs of predation, bloodstains, torn clothing, and drag marks that showed where Tyler's body had been moved after the initial attack. "The attack pattern is consistent with predatory behavior rather than defensive aggression," Dr. Walsh noted as she documented the scene. "The bear approached the camp with calculated stealth, isolated a vulnerable individual, and followed through with feeding behavior. This wasn't a chance encounter or a defensive reaction to surprise. Crime scene photographer Michael Torres worked methodically to document every aspect of the attack site, creating a visual record that would be used in the official investigation report and potentially in legal proceedings if the survivors or Tyler's family chose to file wrongful death claims against the outfitting company. The most difficult part of the investigation was locating and recovering Tyler's remains. The massive brown bear had dragged his body nearly half a mile from the campsite into dense forest where it could feed without disturbance. When the investigation team finally located the site, they found clear evidence that the bear had been feeding on Tyler's body for several hours after the attack. Dr. Walsh examined the remains with clinical detachment, but even her professional experience couldn't completely shield her from the emotional impact of seeing what a 1,200-pound predator could do to a human body. Tyler Johnson had been a healthy, athletic 22-year-old man, but the bear's attack had reduced him to something barely recognizable as human. Cause of death was massive trauma to the chest and neck, Dr. Walsh dictated into her voice recorder. Multiple puncture wounds consistent with brown bear dentition, extensive soft tissue damage, and evidence of post-mortem feeding behavior. The victim's injuries were incompatible with survival. The recovery of Tyler's body required specialized equipment and careful procedures to ensure the safety of the investigation team. Dr. Walsh was acutely aware that the bear responsible for the attack was still in the area and might return to defend what it considered its kill. "We need to work quickly and maintain constant vigilance," Dr. Walsh told her team. This bear has shown no fear of humans and demonstrated willingness to attack. If it decides to return and reclaim its prey, we could have another fatality. The body recovery took nearly 6 hours, with the team working in shifts while armed guards maintained watch for any sign of the killer bear. When Tyler's remains were finally secured for transport, Dr. Walsh felt a profound sadness for the young man whose wilderness adventure had ended in such tragedy. Back in Kodiak, Tyler's parents, Robert and Linda Johnson, arrived on the first available flight from Phoenix. They'd received the devastating news of their son's death through a phone call from the Alaska State Troopers, and the long flight to Alaska had given them too much time to imagine the circumstances of Tyler's final moments. Robert Johnson was a successful Phoenix real estate developer who'd built his career on careful risk assessment and calculated decision-making. The idea that his son had been killed by a bear while camping in the wilderness was almost incomprehensible to him. He'd spent Tyler's entire childhood teaching him to be cautious, to think through consequences, to avoid unnecessary risks. "How could this happen?" Robert asked Detective Hendricks during their meeting at the hospital. "Tyler was smart, well-prepared, experienced. How does a smart kid end up getting killed by a bear?" Detective Hendricks had been through this conversation dozens of times with families of wilderness accident victims. "Alaska is inherently dangerous, Mr. Johnson. Even with the best preparation and equipment, there are risks that can't be completely eliminated. Your son was trying to help a friend in danger. That speaks to his character, even if the outcome was tragic." Linda Johnson was struggling with a different kind of grief. As Tyler's mother, she'd always worried about his adventurous streak, his tendency to push boundaries and seek out challenges that seemed unnecessarily dangerous. She'd opposed the Alaska trip from the beginning, and now her worst fears had been realized. "I begged him not to go," Linda sobbed during her interview. "I told him Alaska was too dangerous, that something like this could happen. But he was so determined to prove himself, to show that he could handle anything." The Johnsons' grief was complicated by anger at the decisions that had led to their son's death. They struggled to understand why the expedition hadn't been abandoned earlier, when the bear's aggressive behavior became obvious, why their son had been allowed to take the kind of risks that led to his death. "Someone should have stopped him," Robert said during a meeting with the Guide Services insurance representatives. "A professional guide should have recognized the danger and called for evacuation before anyone got hurt." Jack Kowalski was struggling with his own guilt and self-doubt about the decisions he'd made during the expedition. As the professional guide, he bore responsibility for keeping his clients safe, and Tyler's death represented the ultimate failure of that responsibility. "I've replayed those final days hundreds of times," Jack told his supervisor during a post-incident interview. "I knew the bear was showing unusual persistence and aggression. I should have forced evacuation after the second night, regardless of what the clients wanted to do." "You followed proper protocols," his supervisor replied. "You warned them about the risks, implemented appropriate safety measures, and gave them accurate information about the dangers they were facing. The decision to continue was ultimately theirs to make." But Jack wasn't satisfied with that explanation. He'd been the expert, the person with years of experience in situations like this. Tyler and his friends had been college students on their second wilderness expedition, completely dependent on his judgment and guidance. The investigation into Tyler's death took several weeks to complete, involving multiple agencies and extensive analysis of the circumstances that had led to the fatal attack. Dr. Walsh's report concluded that the bear responsible was an unusually large and aggressive male that had learned to associate human activity with food sources. This individual demonstrated behavior patterns consistent with a predator rather than a defensive animal, Dr. Walsh wrote in her final report. The systematic stalking, patient approach and feeding behavior following the attack indicate that this bear had developed hunting strategies specifically targeting humans. The report recommended that the bear be located and destroyed to prevent additional attacks, but the massive male had disappeared into the vast wilderness of Afognak Island. Despite extensive search efforts involving helicopters, tracking dogs, and experienced hunters, the bear was never found. Wildlife authorities suspected that the animal had moved to a different part of its territory or possibly swum to one of the neighboring islands. Brown bears were excellent swimmers and had been known to travel miles between islands in search of food or mates. Unfortunately, it's quite possible that this bear will encounter other humans in the future, Dr. Walsh warned in her report. The behavior patterns we documented suggest an animal that has lost its natural fear of humans and developed predatory associations with human activity. The legal aftermath of Tyler's death was complex and emotionally draining for everyone involved. The Johnson family filed wrongful death lawsuits against the guide service, the outfitting company, and the charter service that had flown them to Afognak Island. They alleged that inadequate safety protocols, insufficient warning about the bear threat, and poor decision-making by the guide had contributed to their son's death. The Guide Services Insurance Company hired a team of wilderness safety experts to analyze the decisions made during the expedition. Their investigation concluded that while some judgment calls could have been made differently, the Guide Service had followed industry-standard protocols and had provided appropriate warnings about the risks involved. Wilderness expeditions inherently involve risks that cannot be completely eliminated. The insurance company's expert witness testified during depositions. The clients were repeatedly warned about bear dangers and were given accurate information about the increasing aggression of the individual they encountered. But the Johnson family's attorneys argued that the Guide Service had a professional responsibility to override client preferences when safety concerns reached critical levels. They contended that Jack Kowalski should have forced evacuation after the bear's first aggressive encounter, regardless of Tyler's desire to continue the expedition. A 22-year-old college student doesn't have the experience or expertise to make life-and-death decisions about bear behavior, the family's attorney argued. That's exactly why they hired a professional guide to make those decisions for them. The legal proceedings dragged on for nearly 2 years, keeping Tyler's death in the public eye and preventing his family and friends from achieving any sense of closure. Media coverage of the case focused on questions about wilderness safety protocols and the responsibilities of guide services to protect clients from their own poor decisions. Marcus Rivera, who had been Tyler's closest friend and roommate, found himself caught between loyalty to his friend's memory and recognition that Tyler's determination to continue the expedition had contributed to his own death. During his deposition for the lawsuit, Marcus struggled to balance honesty about Tyler's decision-making with his desire to protect his friend's reputation. Tyler was incredibly determined and sometimes stubborn about achieving his goals, Marcus testified. He'd been planning this trip for over a year, and he saw it as proof that he could handle any challenge. When problems came up, his instinct was to push through them rather than quit. Did you believe it was safe to continue the expedition given the bear's aggressive behavior? The Johnson family's attorney asked. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with conflicting loyalties and painful memories. I was scared, he admitted finally. We all were. But Tyler was so confident that we could handle it, and Jack was the expert, so we trusted their judgment. Jessica Morrison's testimony was particularly difficult as she continued to struggle with survivors' guilt over Tyler's death. Tyler died trying to save my life, she said through tears. I'll never be able to repay that debt or stop wondering if I could have done something differently. The lawsuit was eventually settled out of court for an undisclosed amount, with the Guide Services Insurance Company agreeing to pay compensation to the Johnson family without admitting liability. The settlement included provisions for improved safety protocols and additional training for wilderness guides, but it couldn't bring Tyler back or erase the trauma his death had caused. Dr. Patricia Morales continued working with the survivors of Tyler's expedition for over a year following the attack, helping them process their trauma and develop coping strategies for the long-term psychological effects of witnessing their friend's violent death. Trauma like this doesn't just go away with time, Dr. Morales explained during a group session 6 months after the attack. You'll carry these memories for the rest of your lives, but you can learn to manage their impact and find meaning in Tyler's sacrifice. Marcus had developed severe anxiety about outdoor activities and had given up the hiking and camping that had once been important parts of his life. "I can't stop seeing Tyler getting attacked every time I'm in the wilderness," he said. "Even being in city parks makes me nervous." Jessica had changed her major from environmental science to psychology, inspired by her work with Dr. Morales to help other trauma survivors. "Tyler died trying to help someone else," she said. "The least I can do is dedicate my life to helping people heal from trauma." David had completed his pre-med studies and was applying to medical school with the goal of becoming an emergency physician. "I want to be able to save people in situations where Tyler couldn't be saved," he explained. "Maybe I can prevent other families from going through what the Johnsons are experiencing." Sarah and Andrew had married shortly after graduating and were working as a nurse-physician team in rural Arizona. Their shared trauma from Tyler's death had strengthened their relationship, but it had also made them both more risk-averse in their personal and professional lives. Carlos and Emma had struggled with different aspects of their trauma. Carlos had developed an intense interest in bear behavior and wildlife management, spending hours researching the psychological and behavioral factors that had led to Tyler's death. Emma had given up photography entirely, unable to look through a camera lens without remembering the images she'd captured during their expedition. Robert and Linda Johnson divorced 18 months after Tyler's death, their marriage unable to survive the stress of losing their only child and the lengthy legal proceedings that followed. Robert threw himself into his real estate business with obsessive intensity, working 18-hour days to avoid thinking about his son's final moments. Linda moved to Oregon to live with her sister, unable to remain in Phoenix, where every familiar place reminded her of Tyler. "We created Tyler together, raised him together, and loved him together," Linda said during one of her final conversations with Robert, "but we can't grieve him together. The pain is too much for both of us to carry in the same space." The anniversary of Tyler's death became an annual gathering for the survivors, a bittersweet reunion where they shared memories of their friend and reflected on how the tragedy had changed their lives. They met in different locations each year: Phoenix, Minneapolis, Seattle, El Paso, but never anywhere that involved wilderness camping. "Tyler would probably be disappointed in us for giving up outdoor adventures," Marcus said during the second anniversary gathering. "But I think he'd understand that we're all processing this differently." "He'd want us to remember the good parts of our trips together," Jessica added. "The sense of accomplishment, the incredible natural beauty, the feeling of being completely self-reliant. Those experiences were important to him, even if they ended tragically." Jack Kowalski left the Guide Service 6 months after Tyler's death, unable to continue working in wilderness environments where he felt responsible for keeping people safe from dangers he couldn't completely control. He moved to Anchorage and took a job with the National Weather Service, where his outdoor skills and Alaska experience were valuable, but didn't involve direct responsibility for other people's lives. "I still love the wilderness," Jack said during a follow-up interview with investigators. but I can't take responsibility for other people's safety out there anymore. Tyler's death taught me that there are some risks that can't be managed, no matter how experienced you are. Captain Sarah Morrison continued flying charter flights to wilderness destinations throughout Alaska, but she instituted new protocols requiring extensive safety briefings and signed acknowledgements of risk from all passengers. "I want people to understand what they're getting into," she explained. "Alaska doesn't forgive mistakes or poor judgment." Dr. Jennifer Walsh published a comprehensive study of the bear attack in the Journal of Wildlife Management, analyzing the behavioral patterns that had led to Tyler's death and recommending improved safety protocols for wilderness expeditions in brown bear habitat. This incident represents a perfect storm of factors that created an unusually dangerous situation, Dr. Walsh wrote. An exceptionally large and aggressive bear, a group with limited experience, and decision-making that prioritized adventure goals over safety. Considerations combined to produce a tragic but preventable outcome. The study became required reading for wilderness guides throughout Alaska and was used to develop new training programs for people working in bear country. Tyler's death, while tragic, contributed to improved safety protocols that would protect future wilderness travelers. But for those who knew Tyler Johnson personally, no amount of policy changes or improved safety protocols could compensate for the loss of a friend whose enthusiasm for life and adventure had been infectious. Tyler had dreamed of experiences that would test his limits and prove his capabilities, and in a sense, he had achieved exactly what he'd always said he wanted, an adventure that would be remembered for the rest of his friends' lives. The tragedy was that Tyler's adventure had ended not with triumph and accomplishment, but with a violent death that served as a brutal reminder of the difference between seeking challenge and courting disaster. His friends would carry the memory of his final heroic act for the rest of their lives, but they would also carry the knowledge that his death might have been prevented if they had all been more willing to acknowledge their limitations and accept that some challenges are beyond human capability to overcome. In the end, Tyler Johnson's story became a cautionary tale about the importance of respecting the wilderness and recognizing when adventure crosses the line into recklessness. His death served as a reminder that Alaska's natural beauty conceals genuine dangers that don't care about human dreams, preparation, or determination to succeed. The vast wilderness of Afognak Island continued its ancient rhythms, indifferent to the human drama that had briefly disrupted its peace. The massive brown bear that had killed Tyler Johnson disappeared into the forest, returning to the eternal cycle of hunting, territory, and survival that had governed his kind for thousands of years before humans ever set foot in Alaska. Somewhere in that wilderness, Tyler's blood had soaked into the earth, becoming part of the ecosystem he had loved so much and understood so little. His adventure had ended exactly as nature intended, with the strong consuming the weak, the adapted surviving the unprepared, and the wilderness reclaiming what had always belonged to it. Tyler Johnson had come to Alaska seeking an adventure that would test his limits and prove his courage. In the end, he found both and learned in the most final way possible that some tests are meant to be failed and some limits are not meant to be crossed.